I rented the cabin because it was cheap and far away from everything. That was the only reason. I did not need peace or healing or some deep moment with nature. I just needed to disappear for a while without spending much money. The listing said the cabin was old, basic, and off-grid, but still solid. It showed pictures of rough wooden walls, a small porch, a stove, and trees packed so close together that the sunlight looked thin and weak. The road to get there was marked as rough, and the nearest town was over an hour away. That suited me fine. The drive itself felt longer than it should have. Once I left the main road, the pavement turned into gravel, and then the gravel turned into dirt. The dirt road twisted through thick forest, and the trees grew closer the farther I went. Branches leaned over the road like they were trying to touch the roof of my car. The sound of tires crunching on loose stones echoed too loudly inside the trees, and I kept checking my mirrors even though I knew there was nothing behind me. By the time I reached the end of the road, the light had started to fade. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall trees. It looked smaller in real life than in the photos. The wood was dark from age and weather. The porch boards sagged slightly in the middle, and the steps creaked under my weight. The air smelled damp and old, like wet leaves and soil that never fully dried. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was quiet in a heavy way, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. Dust floated in the last strips of daylight coming through the windows. There was one main room with a small table, a chair, a couch that had seen better years, and a cast iron stove. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything smelled like old wood, metal, and something faintly sour. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. There was no signal on my phone, which I expected. I put it on airplane mode and set it down. I checked the windows, locking them even though I felt a little silly doing it. The forest outside looked dark already, the trees blending together into one thick wall. That night, I cooked a simple meal on the stove and ate it in silence. The fire popped softly, and every sound seemed louder because there was nothing else to compete with it. When the wind moved through the trees, it made a low, rushing sound, like distant water. I told myself it was normal. Cabins make noise. Forests make noise. Nothing about this place was dangerous. Still, when I went to bed, I left a small lamp on. I slept lightly, not badly, but not deeply either. Every time the cabin creaked, I half woke. The wood expanded and settled as the temperature dropped, and I kept mistaking those sounds for something else. Once, sometime in the night, I heard a sharp noise outside, like something hard hitting wood. I froze, listening, my heart beating faster than it should have. Nothing followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a branch falling or an animal bumping into the porch. Morning came gray and cold. Fog hung low between the trees, thick enough that I could not see far beyond the clearing. The cabin looked even older in daylight. The boards were cracked in places, and the roof sagged slightly at one corner. I walked around the outside, checking things out. There were footprints in the dirt near the porch, but I told myself they were mine from the night before. I spent most of that day cleaning and organizing. It helped me relax. I swept the floors, wiped surfaces, and rearranged a few things. The more time I spent inside, the more I noticed how isolated the cabin really was. No distant traffic sounds, no planes overhead, just wind, birds, and the occasional rustle from the forest. In the afternoon, I took a short walk down a narrow trail behind the cabin. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in pine needles and dead leaves. The trees blocked most of the sky, making it feel like early evening even though it was still daytime. I did not go far. Something about the way the forest pressed in made me uneasy, like the space around me was shrinking. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was closed. I was sure I had left it open to let the place air out. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling stupid for letting my nerves get to me. The wind must have blown it shut. I opened it and stepped inside. That night, the sounds seemed closer. The wind was stronger, pushing against the cabin, making the walls groan softly. Something scratched against the side of the building once, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was a branch. I repeated that in my head until I believed it enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I found marks on the outside wall near the bedroom window. Long, shallow lines in the wood. They could have been from branches rubbing over time, but they looked fresher than the rest of the wall. I touched them with my fingers. The grooves were clean, not weathered. I tried not to think about it. As the days passed, small things began to feel off. Nothing dramatic, just details that did not add up. Items seemed slightly out of place. The chair by the table angled differently than I remembered. The bathroom door was open when I was sure I had closed it. Once, I found dirt on the kitchen floor near the door, pressed into the wood like it had been stepped on. I stopped going far from the cabin. I stayed close, keeping busy with small tasks. The forest felt different now. The quiet was heavier. The birds were fewer. When the wind stopped, the silence felt wrong, like something holding its breath. One evening, as I sat near the stove, I noticed the smell again. That faint sour scent, stronger now. It reminded me of damp fabric left too long in a closed space. I searched the cabin, checking the bathroom, the bedroom, even the small storage area under the stairs. I found nothing. That night, I did not sleep much. I kept hearing movement outside. Slow steps in the leaves. Something brushing against the porch. At one point, I heard what sounded like weight shifting near the wall, followed by a soft thud. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, my body tense. In the morning, there were new footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They were not mine. They were larger, deeper, and uneven, like whoever made them was carrying weight or limping. They circled the cabin once before heading back toward the trees. I felt fear then, real fear. Not the vague unease from before, but a sharp awareness that something was wrong. I considered leaving, packing up and driving back the way I came. But a part of me hesitated. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. A hunter, a hiker, someone passing through. That explanation did not hold up when I found the shed. I had not noticed it before because it was partly hidden behind thick brush. It sat about 50 yards from the cabin, old and leaning, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The wood was gray and splintered. The air around it smelled worse than the cabin, heavy and stale. Inside, the shed was nearly empty. Just dirt floor, a few broken tools, and deep scuff marks near the back wall. The ground there was disturbed, packed down hard, like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. There were scraps of fabric caught on a nail, dark stains soaked into the dirt. I left the shed quickly, my heart pounding. I did not look back until I was inside the cabin with the door locked. The realization settled slowly. Someone else was here. Someone who knew this place better than I did. Someone who had been watching. That evening, I packed my bag. I planned to leave at first light. I did not want to drive the road in the dark. I ate very little, my appetite gone. I kept the lamp on and sat with my back against the wall, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard the door handle move. It was slow, careful, like whoever was outside did not want to make noise. The handle turned just enough to test it. Then it stopped. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound moved to a window. Fingers brushed against the glass, leaving faint streaks. I could hear breathing then, shallow and uneven. The person circled the cabin once, stopping at each window, checking. When the footsteps moved away, I did not relax. I knew they would come back. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. As soon as there was enough light to see, I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal, peaceful even. Birds had returned, singing softly. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then I saw the marks on my car. Deep scratches ran along the side. The paint peeled back to bare metal. One tire was slashed, completely flat. Panic surged through me. My way out was gone. I rushed back inside and locked the door, my hands shaking. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I tried anyway, moving around the cabin, holding it up near windows. Nothing. The day dragged on, slow and heavy. I stayed inside, conserving energy, listening. Occasionally, I heard movement in the trees. Once I saw a figure at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, standing still. When I blinked, it was gone. By late afternoon, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. The boards creaked under the weight. The door shook as something pushed against it, testing the strength. I knew then that waiting was no longer an option. I gathered what I could carry and slipped out the back window when the sounds moved to the front. I ran into the trees, not caring about noise or direction. Branches scratched my arms and face. Roots tripped me. I kept going, lungs burning. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. I heard movement behind me, steady and patient. Whoever was following did not rush. They knew the land. They knew I would tire. Eventually, I reached the road. My legs nearly gave out when I saw it. I ran along it until I saw a truck parked near the bend. The driver was inside, engine running. I did not stop until I was pounding on the window, breathless and shaking. The truck drove away with me inside, the forest shrinking in the distance. I reported everything later: the cabin, the shed, the footprints, the damage to my car. Authorities searched the area. They found signs of long-term squatting, evidence that someone had been living off-grid for years, using abandoned structures and hiding deep in the woods. They never found the person. The cabin was condemned. The listing disappeared. The road was blocked off. I still think about that place sometimes, about how quiet it was, how easy it was to believe nothing was wrong, how close I came to staying one more night. The forest did not feel haunted, felt claimed, and I walked into it without realizing I was trespassing. I rented the cabin because I wanted to disappear for a while without actually dying. That was the honest reason. I told people it was for quiet, for writing, for nature, but the real reason was that my life felt loud in a way that never stopped. The kind of noise that follows you even when everything is silent. I wanted a place where the days would pass slowly enough that I could feel time again. The listing showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by trees, miles from the nearest town, with a dirt road that ended right at the front porch. It looked old but solid. Nothing fancy, just a roof, walls, a stove, and space. The drive took almost 6 hours. The last hour was nothing but gravel, potholes, and trees leaning in so close that branches scraped the sides of my car. I remember thinking that if something went wrong out here, no one would know for days. That thought did not scare me at the time. It actually felt calming. I parked beside the cabin and shut off the engine. The silence hit me immediately. No traffic, no distant engines, no voices. Just wind moving through the trees and the soft ticking sound of my engine cooling down. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust when I stepped inside. It was colder than I expected, even though it was late summer. The floorboards creaked under my weight, not in a dramatic way, just the normal sounds of a place that had been standing for decades. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a couch that had probably been brown once, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything looked exactly like the pictures. That mattered to me. It meant no surprises. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right. Food in the small fridge, clothes in the bedroom dresser, a flashlight on the table, extra batteries in my bag. I noticed there was no cell signal. I already knew that from the listing, but seeing the empty bars on my phone made it real. I set the phone down and left it there. I did not want to keep checking it. The first night was calm. I cooked a simple meal, ate at the table, and watched the light fade through the small windows. When it got dark, it got very dark. The trees blocked most of the sky. I turned on the cabin lights and felt like I was inside a small bubble of safety surrounded by blackness. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep where you do not dream. The second day passed quietly. I walked around the area, staying close to the cabin. There were no trails, just uneven ground, rocks, fallen branches, and thick undergrowth. I noticed old tire tracks in the dirt road, but they looked weathered, like they had been there for a long time. I assumed it was the owner or other renters. I went back inside before dark and locked the door, not because I was scared, but because it felt normal to do so. That night, I heard something outside. It was not a dramatic sound. No footsteps, no branches snapping loudly, just a faint noise that pulled me out of sleep. A soft scrape, followed by a pause, then another scrape. I lay still, listening. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the cabin. That explanation felt reasonable, and I wanted to believe it. I stayed in bed, listening until the sound stopped. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed marks near the front door, long, shallow lines in the dirt, as if something had been dragged or scraped there. I crouched down and studied them. They did not look like animal tracks. No clear paw prints, just lines. That made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it could be anything. A branch dragged by the wind, a log moved by someone before I arrived. I did not want to build fear out of uncertainty. The third day felt heavier. The silence did not feel peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. I kept finding myself looking toward the windows, expecting to see movement. I checked the locks more than once. That night, I made sure the flashlight was within reach of the bed. I woke up again after midnight. This time, the sound was closer, right outside the wall near the bedroom. Slow movement, not heavy, not rushed, just something shifting its weight. I held my breath without realizing it. My heart started beating hard enough that I was afraid it would make noise. I waited for something clear, something I could label. A cough, a snort, a growl. None of that came. After several minutes, the sound moved away. I stayed awake until morning. When daylight came, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Around the back, near the small window above the sink, I saw footprints. Human footprints. The dirt was soft there, and the shape was clear. Adult-sized boots. Fresh. My stomach tightened in a way I had not felt before. This was not a misunderstanding. Someone had been here during the night. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving back down that long dirt road. The problem was that part of me still wanted a simple explanation. Maybe the owner checking something. Maybe another renter who got confused. I hated that I was trying to talk myself out of what was obvious. Someone had walked around my cabin while I slept. I locked the door and stayed inside for most of the day. I kept the lights off to avoid drawing attention at night. When darkness came, I sat on the couch, listening. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of the wind. Just as I started to relax, I heard a knock. It was soft, not forceful, just a single careful knock on the front door. I did not move. I did not breathe. I stared at the door as if it might open on its own. Another knock came, slightly louder. Still no voice. No attempt to open the door, just knocking, then nothing. The knocking did not come again that night. I did not sleep. The next morning, I packed my bag. I was done pretending this was nothing. I stepped outside to load my car and froze. My front tire was flat, completely deflated. I stood there staring at it, feeling the weight of the situation settle over me. This was no accident. Someone wanted me to stay. I changed the tire slowly, constantly scanning the trees. Every sound felt sharp. When I finished, I noticed something else. Deep scratches on the driver's side door. Long, deliberate marks through the dirt and into the paint. My hands shook as I got into the car. The engine did not start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead, or something worse. I got out and opened the hood, even though I knew nothing about engines. Something had been tampered with, wires out of place. This was intentional. I went back inside and locked the door. Panic tried to take over, but I forced myself to stay calm. I inventoried what I had. Food for a few days, water, a flashlight, a knife from the kitchen. No signal, no way to call for help. I realized then how truly alone I was. That night, the sounds came earlier. Footsteps, clear this time. Slow, circling the cabin. I moved quietly from window to window, keeping the lights off. Through a small gap in the curtains, I saw a shape. A person standing near the tree line, watching the cabin. I could not see their face, just the outline. Still, patient. They did not approach. They just stood there for a long time, then disappeared back into the trees. The next day, I found more signs. My car keys were gone. I knew I had brought them inside. They were no longer anywhere in the cabin. That was when fear turned into something colder and more focused. I was not dealing with random behavior. This was controlled, planned. I started keeping a journal, writing everything down. Times, sounds, details. It helped me feel anchored. I marked the days. On the 5th night, the person came closer than ever before. I heard them touch the door, fingers brushing the wood, testing, not trying to force it, just learning. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against the wall, knife in my hand, waiting for something that never came. On the 6th day, I noticed smoke in the distance. Thin, gray, rising above the trees. Someone had a fire going. Nearby. That meant they were staying close. Comfortable. I understood then that this was not about robbery or confusion. This was about control. That night, the door handle moved. Slowly. Carefully. The lock held. I pressed myself into the corner, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The handle stopped moving. A long pause followed. Then footsteps moving away. I knew I could not stay another night. Before dawn, I packed everything I could carry. I decided to leave on foot, follow the dirt road. It would take hours, maybe all day, but staying meant something worse. I waited until the light started to return to the sky, then stepped outside. The air felt different, heavy. I walked quickly, not running, forcing myself to stay quiet. I kept checking behind me. The road stretched on endlessly. After about an hour, I heard movement behind me, footsteps matching my pace. I did not turn around. I walked faster. The footsteps did the same. My chest burned. My legs ached. Finally, I broke into a run. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then a sound cut through everything. An engine. A truck appeared ahead on the road, coming toward me. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The truck slowed, then stopped. I did not look back. I climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door. The driver did not ask questions. They just drove. I did not stop shaking until we reached the main road. I reported everything to the police. They searched the area. They found evidence of someone living in the woods nearby. A makeshift camp, tools, food wrappers, signs of long-term presence. They never found the person. I went home after that. I never returned to the cabin. The experience stayed with me, not as a story I tell for shock, but as a reminder of how thin safety really is. There was no monster, no ghost, no curse. Just another human being, choosing to watch, to wait, to control. That was the scariest part of all. I still think about the silence out there sometimes, how it felt before I understood what it really meant. I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet and because I believed I could handle being alone for a while. The place was far from town, deep in a stretch of forest where the road turned into gravel and then into something that barely deserved to be called a road at all. It was late fall, the kind of time when the leaves were mostly gone and the trees stood bare and thin, making the woods feel open and exposed during the day but tight and heavy at night. I told myself that the season was good because there would be fewer people around, fewer hikers, fewer hunters, fewer reasons for trouble. I thought quiet meant safe. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who rarely used it anymore. It had been built decades ago, long before phones worked out there, long before anyone worried about being connected all the time. It was a simple structure with old wood siding, a metal roof, and a small porch that sagged a little in the middle. The windows were narrow, meant to keep heat in and eyes out. There was a heavy wooden door with a deadbolt that looked solid but old. When I unlocked it and pushed it open, the smell of cold wood, dust, and something faintly metallic hit me right away. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected and also worse in small ways I did not think about until I was standing there alone. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table, and a couch that had probably been comfortable once. There was a bedroom in the back and a tiny bathroom with a shower that only worked when the water pump felt like cooperating. A wood stove sat against one wall, blackened from years of use. Everything was quiet in a way that felt thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. I spent the first day settling in. I unloaded my food, stacked firewood near the stove, checked the generator, and walked around the property to remind myself where things were. The forest stretched out in every direction, uneven ground covered with leaves, fallen branches, and patches of dark soil. The trees were a mix of pine and hardwood, tall enough to block most of the sky when I stood beneath them. There were no nearby cabins that I could see. No signs of recent activity other than a few old tire tracks near the road and animal prints pressed into the mud. As the sun went down that first evening, the temperature dropped fast. I lit the stove and watched the fire catch, listening to the crackle and pop of burning wood. The sound was comforting at first. It gave the cabin a sense of life, like the building was breathing with me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making them creak and whisper. I told myself that every sound had a simple reason. Wind, animals, old wood shifting as it cooled. That night I slept lightly. The bed was narrow, and the mattress dipped toward the center. Every noise woke me, a branch scraping against the side of the cabin, something moving on the porch, the stove settling as the fire died down. Each time I woke up, I stayed still and listened until my breathing slowed again. By morning, I felt tired but proud of myself for getting through the first night without panicking. The second day passed slowly. I cooked simple meals, read, and stepped outside now and then just to remind myself that the world still existed beyond the cabin walls. The sky stayed gray, and the air felt heavy, like snow might come later even though it was not forecast. Around midday, I noticed something that made me pause. Near the edge of the clearing, close to where the road disappeared into the trees, there were footprints that had not been there the day before. They were human footprints. I crouched down to look at them more closely. The ground was soft enough to hold the shape clearly. They were the size of adult boots, deep and steady, not rushed. They did not look old. They came from the direction of the road and went deeper into the woods, not toward the cabin but not far from it either. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the marks as if they might explain themselves if I waited. I told myself it could have been anyone, a hunter, someone walking through, someone who had been there before me and left tracks that I somehow missed. The logic felt thin, but it was enough to keep me from packing up and leaving right then. I went back inside and locked the door, feeling slightly foolish for being uneasy over something so small. That evening, the wind picked up. The trees moved more, their branches rubbing together and against the cabin. I stayed inside and kept the fire going, the glow of the flames casting long shadows across the walls. The cabin felt smaller at night. The corners seemed darker, the ceiling lower. Every time the wind gusted hard, the walls groaned softly, and I imagined the whole structure shifting on its foundation. Sometime after dark, I heard a sound that did not fit with the others. It was faint but clear enough to cut through the wind. It sounded like footsteps on gravel. I froze where I sat. The sound came again, slower this time, heavier. Someone was walking near the cabin. I stayed still and listened, my heart pounding hard enough that I worried it would drown out everything else. The footsteps moved around the side of the building, then stopped. I waited for more, but there was only the wind and the fire. I told myself that if someone was out there, they would knock or call out. When nothing like that happened, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer or something larger moving across the gravel. The idea did not sit right, but I clung to it anyway. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me towards sleep, though it was restless and shallow. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately saw fresh footprints on the gravel near the porch. They were closer than the ones from the day before, close enough that whoever made them had stood near the door. I followed them with my eyes. They circled the cabin once, then headed back toward the trees. I stood there in the cold air, feeling exposed and foolish for ignoring my instincts. Someone had been there during the night. Someone had walked around the cabin while I was inside, awake and listening. The realization made my stomach twist. I went back inside, locked the door, and checked every window. They were all closed, all intact. For the rest of the day, I stayed tense. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the tree line for movement. I thought about leaving, about packing up and driving away, but part of me felt stubborn. I had come here for peace, and the idea of being chased off by fear made me angry with myself. As the light faded again, the weather shifted. A cold rain started to fall, tapping against the roof and windows. The sound was constant and dull, blending with the wind until it felt like the cabin was surrounded by static noise. Visibility dropped fast. The trees beyond the clearing faded into dark shapes. That night was worse than the first. The rain covered some sounds but made others sharper. Every drop that hit the roof sounded like a step at first. I sat with my back to the wall, watching the door, listening. Hours passed that way, my body stiff and sore. Sometime after midnight, the generator cut out. The sudden silence was shocking. The hum that had been in the background since I arrived vanished, leaving only the rain and the wind. The lights went out, and the cabin fell into deep shadow. I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for the generator to kick back on. It did not. I moved slowly, using a flashlight to check the breaker and the fuel. Everything looked fine, but the generator refused to start. I shut it down completely and went back inside, feeling more alone than I had at any point before. Without the steady noise of the machine, the outside world felt closer, like the forest was pressing in. That was when I heard movement on the porch. It was not heavy footsteps this time. It was lighter, careful. The sound of weight shifting, of someone standing just outside the door. I held the flashlight in one hand, the other resting on the table, fingers digging into the wood. I did not move. I did not make a sound. The handle on the door turned slightly, just enough to test it. The deadbolt held. I stayed frozen, every muscle tight. The handle stopped moving. I waited for footsteps retreating back into the rain, but instead there was the sound of breathing. It was faint but close, right on the other side of the door. Someone was standing there, listening just as I was. Time stretched out in a way I had never experienced before. Seconds felt like minutes. My thoughts raced, jumping from one terrible possibility to another. I thought about the windows, about how thin the walls were, about how far I was from help. The breathing eventually stopped. After a long pause, footsteps moved away from the porch, slow and unhurried. I did not sleep at all after that. When morning came, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground soaked and the air cold. I waited until full daylight before opening the door. On the porch, there were muddy footprints facing the door, close enough that I could see the pattern of the sole clearly. Next to them, pressed into the wet wood, were marks where someone had leaned forward, putting their weight against the door. I felt sick. I knew then that staying was not an option. Whatever reasons had brought me there no longer mattered. I packed quickly, shoving things into my bag without caring about order. Every few seconds, I looked up, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or watching from the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I loaded my car and got in, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept checking the mirrors. The trees closed in on both sides, the road twisting and dipping. I did not relax until I reached the paved road miles away. I reported what happened to the local authorities later that day. They took the information seriously but had little to go on. Remote areas like that did not have many cameras or witnesses. They said they would check it out, maybe patrol the area more often. Weeks passed, and I tried to put the experience behind me. I went back to my normal routines, back to noise and people and familiar places. Still, the memory stayed sharp. At night, I sometimes woke up thinking I heard footsteps outside my door. Months later, I got a call telling me that someone had been arrested not far from where the cabin was. He had been living off the grid, moving between abandoned structures and camps deep in the woods. When they searched the area near the cabin, they found signs that he had been watching it for some time. Paths worn into the undergrowth, places where he had stood for long periods, looking toward the building. They told me that my leaving when I did was likely what kept things from getting worse. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of it still makes my chest feel tight. What stays with me the most is not the fear I felt in the moment, but the understanding that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just watches quietly, waiting, hidden in places that seem empty and safe until they are not. I drove into the mountains because I needed time alone and because I thought I understood what being alone really meant. I had rented a small wooden cabin that sat deep inside a national forest, far away from towns, cell towers, and paved roads. The listing said it was simple and old, built decades ago by a family that used it for hunting seasons. That was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no noise, no distractions. Just trees, cold air, and silence. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and full of cracks. Pine needles covered most of it, and fallen branches scraped the underside of my car as I drove slowly. The forest felt thick and heavy, like it pressed in from both sides. The sky above was gray and low, and the light felt weak, even though it was still early afternoon. I noticed how quickly the temperature dropped as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I reached the last turn, my breath fogged up the windshield when I exhaled. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees. It was smaller than I expected, darker too. The wood had turned almost black from years of weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small and dusty. There was no fence, no sign, nothing else around it except trees and rocks. The nearest road behind me disappeared once I parked. When I shut off the engine, the silence hit me hard. It felt complete, like the world had stopped moving. I stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment. The air smelled sharp and clean, mixed with damp wood and pine sap. Somewhere far away, I could hear wind moving through treetops, but nothing close. No birds, no insects. That should have felt peaceful, but instead it made my skin tighten. I grabbed my bag and walked up the short set of wooden steps to the front door. The door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled old, like dust, cold ash, and dried wood. One small room held everything. A rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a small kitchen area with a sink and a propane stove. A stone fireplace took up one corner. The windows let in very little light, and the corners of the room stayed dark even during the day. I set my bag down and walked slowly around, touching things without really thinking about it. The table had knife marks carved into it, deep and uneven. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and some felt softer than others. The bed mattress was thin and smelled faintly of mold. Everything felt worn but still usable, like it had been abandoned rather than forgotten. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. I wanted to settle in, to make the place feel less strange. I stacked my food supplies on a shelf, laid out my clothes, and filled the sink with water from a large jug I had brought. There was no running water, just what I carried with me. I reminded myself that I had planned for this. I had enough food for a week, extra fuel, and a full tank of gas. As the afternoon went on, the light outside dimmed faster than I expected. Clouds thickened, and the forest seemed to grow darker. By the time I finished unpacking, it already felt like evening. I stepped outside again to gather some firewood before it got too dark. The cold bit harder now, and the air felt heavier. The area around the cabin was uneven, covered in leaves, rocks, and fallen branches. I noticed old tree stumps scattered around, some with deep cuts in them. Whoever had lived here before had spent a lot of time chopping wood. As I bent to pick up dry branches, I had the sudden feeling that I was being watched. It came out of nowhere, sharp and uncomfortable. I straightened up quickly and scanned the trees. There was nothing, just trunks, shadows, and stillness. I told myself it was nerves, the new place getting to me. I forced myself to keep gathering wood, but I stayed closer to the cabin after that. When night came, it came fully. There were no streetlights, no glow from distant houses. The darkness outside the cabin was thick and solid. Inside, the fire cast weak orange light that danced on the walls. The shadows moved constantly, stretching and shrinking as the flames shifted. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly, listening to the small sounds the cabin made as it cooled. Pops from the fire, faint creaks from the wood. Every sound felt louder than it should have. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew there was no signal. The screen felt useless in my hand. I went to bed early, lying on my back and staring up at the ceiling. The darkness pressed in around me. The forest outside stayed silent for a long time. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. First, I did not know why. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was cold. My breath formed faint clouds in the air. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Not wind, not an animal. It was slow and deliberate. A crunch, then another. Footsteps. They were far at first, but close enough to hear clearly. Each step crushed leaves and twigs. The sound circled the cabin slowly, unhurried. I held my breath without meaning to. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my neck. The footsteps stopped near one of the windows. I stayed completely still, staring at the dark glass. Nothing moved. After a long time, the steps moved away again, fading back into the forest. I did not sleep after that. I stayed awake until morning, sitting on the bed with my jacket on, gripping a flashlight in my hand. When daylight finally came, it felt weak and pale, but it was enough to make me feel slightly safer. I went outside as soon as I could see clearly. The ground around the cabin showed footprints. Human footprints. They were large, deep, and fresh. They circled the cabin just like I had heard during the night. They did not belong to me. I followed them for a short distance, my stomach tight. They led into the trees and disappeared where the ground turned rocky. I forced myself to stop there. I did not want to go any farther. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to act normal, to stick to the plan I had made before coming here. I cooked, cleaned, and read, but my attention kept drifting to the windows. Every sound outside made me flinch. Branches snapping, wind moving through leaves, even my own footsteps inside the cabin. I considered leaving. The thought stayed with me all day, but another part of me felt stubborn. I told myself that someone might have wandered through the area, maybe a hunter or a hiker. The forest was public land. People passed through sometimes. That explanation felt thin, but I held on to it. That night, I locked the door and pushed the table against it. The lock itself was old and simple, barely more than a metal latch. I kept the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen close to me. The fire burned low again, and shadows filled the room. The footsteps returned after midnight. This time, they came closer. I heard them approach the front of the cabin, stop, then move toward the side. The sound of something brushing against the wall made my skin crawl. Then came a new sound. Fingernails or something hard scraping lightly against the wood. Slow, careful, testing. I stayed silent, barely breathing. The scraping moved along the wall, then stopped near the door. There was a pause that felt endless. Then the handle moved. The latch rattled softly, once, then again. Whoever was outside was being careful, trying not to make noise. My hands shook so badly I had to press them against my legs to steady them. The table did not move, but the door flexed slightly under pressure. After a long moment, the pressure stopped. The footsteps moved away again, slower than before, as if the person outside was not in a hurry. When morning came, I did not hesitate anymore. I packed my things quickly, hands shaking the entire time. I did not eat. I did not clean. I just wanted to leave. Outside, more footprints covered the ground. Some overlapped mine from the day before. They were everywhere, close to the windows, the door, the woodpile. Whoever it was had spent a long time walking around the cabin. I got into my car and started it, feeling a rush of relief when the engine turned over. As I backed out, I noticed something tied to one of the trees near the edge of the clearing. A piece of red cloth. It had not been there before. I drove away as fast as the road allowed. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and rocks bounced under the tires. I did not slow down until the trees began to thin and the road widened. I reported what happened when I reached a town later that day. I told them about the footprints, the sounds, the cloth. They listened, took notes, and said they would look into it. I could tell from their faces that they did not expect to find much. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about the cabin, but the memories stayed sharp. The silence, the footsteps, the careful way the door handle had moved. Months later, I saw a short article online. A hiker had gone missing in the same forest. His camp was found abandoned. There were signs that someone had been watching him before he disappeared. I never went back to that cabin. I never spent a night alone in the deep woods again. The forest did not need ghosts or monsters to be dangerous. Sometimes, all it took was another person, hidden by trees and darkness, with time and patience. I went to the cabin because I needed quiet and distance, not because I liked the woods. The cabin sat deep in state land, far from towns and paved roads, the kind of place people used once and then forgot about. It belonged to my uncle, who stopped coming after his knees gave out. He let me use it as long as I locked up and kept the place from rotting. I told myself it would be simple. A few days alone, some repairs, some reading, some sleep without noise. The road in was barely a road anymore, just dirt packed hard by old tires, with weeds growing down the center like a thin green scar. Branches scraped along the sides of my truck. The woods felt tight and close, like they were leaning in. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly on one side. The porch boards were gray and dry, curled at the edges. The place smelled like damp wood and leaves even from the truck. I unloaded slowly. Food, water, tools, a sleeping bag, even though the cabin had a bed. I always liked having my own. The front door stuck when I opened it, swelling from moisture. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust floated in the light from the windows. Everything was where it should be. Table, chairs, small stove, shelves with old cans and jars. Nothing looked touched. That made me relax more than I realized at the time. The first day passed without much happening. I fixed a loose step on the porch. I cleared leaves from the roof edge. I swept inside. I noticed small things like how quiet it was once the wind died down. No traffic, no distant machines, just the sound of trees shifting and the occasional bird. At night, the darkness felt heavy, like it had weight. The windows showed nothing but my own reflection when the lantern was on. I slept lightly, not because I was scared, but because the bed was stiff and the cabin made normal sounds. Wood popping, something scratching outside that I told myself was an animal. In the morning, everything felt normal again. On the second day, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. My uncle always told me to keep an eye on fallen trees and erosion. I followed the faint path that led behind the cabin toward the creek. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were shallow and partly filled with pine needles, like someone had stepped there a while ago. Not animal. The shape was wrong. Too even. Too wide at the heel. They crossed the path and disappeared into the brush. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the ground, trying to tell myself they were old. Maybe from a hiker. Maybe from a hunter months back. I went back to the cabin and tried to forget about them. I told myself this land was public. People passed through sometimes. That was normal. Still, I locked the door even during the day after that. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin creaked more than before. I lay awake listening, counting the sounds. When something bumped the side of the cabin, my body went stiff. It sounded heavy, like a shoulder or a log. Then nothing. I waited. No footsteps. No scratching. Just wind again. In the morning, I checked the outside wall. There was nothing there. No mark. No damage. I felt stupid for being tense. The third day was when things changed. I noticed the back window was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I was careful like that. The latch sat loose, turned the wrong way. The window itself was closed. No sign of damage. Someone could have reached in from outside if they were tall enough and knew where to press. That thought settled deep in my chest and stayed there. I walked through the cabin slowly, checking every corner. Everything looked the same. My food was untouched. My tools were where I left them. Still, the feeling didn't leave. It wasn't fear yet. It was something closer to awareness, like my body had decided to stay alert whether I wanted it to or not. That afternoon, I found another sign. Near the creek, farther down the path, there was a spot where the ground was flattened, leaves pressed down in a rough oval. like someone had sat there for a long time, close enough to see the cabin through the trees if you knew where to look. I stood there and looked back toward the clearing. From that angle, the cabin was partly hidden, but the porch was visible. The door, the windows, I imagined someone sitting there watching, and the image wouldn't go away. I went back inside and packed my bag halfway. Not fully, just enough so I could leave fast if I needed to. I told myself I was being practical. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every sound felt sharper. Around what I guessed was early morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. The boards creaked under weight. The steps stopped near the door. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited for the door handle to move. Didn't. After a long time, the weight shifted. More creaking. Then the steps moved away. I stayed still until light began to show through the windows. When I finally went outside, the porch boards showed fresh marks. Slight but there. Dirt smudges where boots had stood. The prints led off the porch and into the woods, not toward the road. That was when fear finally set in fully. Not panic. Something colder. Someone had been there. Close. Quiet. Careful. I loaded my truck right then. I didn't care about finishing repairs. I didn't care about being rude to a place. I just wanted to leave. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated. That moment felt longer than it was. Then it started. As I drove out, I kept checking the mirrors. The road felt longer than before. The trees felt closer. When I finally reached pavement, my shoulders dropped like I'd been carrying weight for days. I thought it was over. 2 weeks later, my uncle called me. He sounded confused, not scared. He told me a ranger had stopped by the cabin. Someone had been living there, not inside but nearby. A man with a small camp hidden deep in the brush. He had been watching the cabin for weeks, waiting for it to be empty again. He had food stored, notes written about when lights were on and off, when someone arrived, when they left. The ranger told my uncle the man had a history of breaking into remote properties. He never confronted people directly. He waited, observed, used cabins when owners were gone, sometimes moved things slightly, sometimes unlocked windows to make it easier next time. They caught him because another cabin down the trail had been broken into the night after I left. The timing lined up too well. I realized then how close it had been, how easily I could have stayed one more night, how easily the door could have opened while I slept. I don't go back to the cabin anymore. My uncle sold it a year later. Every now and then, I still think about that spot by the creek, about someone sitting there, quiet and patient, watching a place I thought was empty except for me. The woods didn't feel scary because of what they hid. They felt scary because someone else knew how to hide in them better than I ever could. I drove up to the cabin alone in late October, when the trees were already losing their leaves and the air had that sharp cold smell that gets into your nose and stays there. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend who barely used it anymore. It sat deep in a stretch of forest that most people only passed through on their way to somewhere else. There were no other houses nearby, no phone signal, and only one narrow dirt road leading in and out. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be away from everything. I told myself I wanted peace, but looking back, I think I wanted to disappear for a while without anyone noticing. The drive took hours. The last gas station was far behind me when the paved road turned into gravel. My tires crunched loudly, the sound echoing off the trees. The forest closed in tighter the farther I went. Tall pines and bare-branched trees leaned inward like they were watching the road. The sky was gray and low, pressing down. I kept checking the dashboard clock, not because I was late, but because time felt strange, like it was slowing down the deeper I went. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat in a clearing with patchy grass and muddy ground. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof slightly uneven. One small porch wrapped around the front. There were no lights on, of course. The windows were dark, reflecting the trees behind me. I parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, like someone had dropped a thick blanket over everything. I sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel. I could hear my own breathing. Somewhere far away, a bird called once, then stopped. The air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. I got out of the car and stretched, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The cold hit my face immediately. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled stale, like dust and old smoke. There was a small living area with a couch, a wooden table, and a stone fireplace. A narrow kitchen sat to the side, and a short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was simple and worn. Nothing looked broken, just old and tired. I dropped my bag near the couch and walked around, checking each room. The windows were shut tight. The locks worked. Nothing looked out of place. I told myself everything was fine. I spent the first hour unpacking and lighting a fire. The wood was stacked neatly near the fireplace, dry and ready. The fire crackled and popped, the sound filling the cabin and making it feel less empty. As the light flickered against the walls, the shadows moved slowly, stretching and shrinking. I tried not to stare at them too long. By the time night came, the forest outside was completely dark. No streetlights, no distant glow from other houses, just blackness pressed up against the windows. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove and ate at the table. The silence was constant. Even with the fire, the cabin felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The bedroom was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out into the trees. I closed the curtains tight. As I lay there, I listened to the sounds of the cabin settling. Wood creaking, the wind brushing against the walls. Normal sounds, I told myself. Just normal sounds. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark. The fire long burned down. The air felt colder. I lay still, listening. That was when I noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no animals, nothing. The silence felt deeper than before, heavy and unnatural. Then I heard it, a dull thud from somewhere outside. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like something heavy hitting the ground. I held my breath, straining to listen. A few seconds passed. Then another sound, closer this time. A dragging noise, slow and uneven, like something being pulled across dirt and leaves. My heart started to pound. I stayed in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, a bear maybe. This was their land, not mine. Still, the sound didn't match anything I could easily explain. It was too steady, too deliberate. The noise stopped. I waited a long time, counting my breaths. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains. For a moment, everything felt normal again. I almost laughed at myself for being scared. I got up, made coffee, and stepped outside to get some fresh air. That was when I saw the marks. In the soft ground near the cabin, there were deep grooves, like something heavy had been dragged across the clearing. The dirt was torn up, leaves pushed aside. The marks led from the tree line toward the side of the cabin, then disappeared into harder ground where they were harder to see. I followed them slowly, my coffee forgotten. Near the edge of the clearing, I found footprints. Human footprints, large, uneven, and pressed deep into the mud. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges were still sharp. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My mind raced through explanations. A hunter passing through, someone lost, someone camping nearby. None of them felt right. There were no other signs of people, no tire tracks, no campfire remains, just those footprints and the drag marks. I went back inside and locked the door. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to read, but I kept losing my place. Every sound made me look up. The wind picking up outside made the trees creak and sway. Branches scraped against the cabin walls. Each scrape made my shoulders tense. As evening came, I debated leaving. I could pack up and drive back before it got too dark. But a stubborn part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself I was overreacting. The cabin had been here for years. Nothing had happened to anyone else. I stayed. That night, the sounds came back. Started just after midnight. Slow footsteps outside the cabin. Crunching leaves. Pause. Then more steps. They circled the cabin, unhurried, like whoever was out there knew I was inside and wasn't worried. I sat on the couch in the dark, gripping a flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it could be heard through the walls. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I listened for breathing, for voices, for anything. There was nothing, just silence again. Minutes passed. Then I heard the faint sound of metal scraping against wood near one of the windows. Not enough to break it, just enough to test it. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I did neither. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Eventually, the sounds faded back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I packed my things quickly. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into my bag. I was ready to leave, ready to get back to the road and never come here again. That was when I noticed the door. Deep scratch marks ran along the outside of the front door, long and uneven. Someone had tried to pry it open. The wood was gouged and splintered, the marks stopping just short of the lock. I felt sick. I loaded my bag into the car and got in, my fingers fumbling with the keys. The engine started, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. As I backed up, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. A figure stood there, partially hidden behind a trunk. Tall, thin, wearing dark, dirty clothes. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I knew they were watching me. They didn't move. They didn't wave or run. They just stood there, still as the trees around them. I drove away as fast as I could without losing control on the gravel road. I didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every bend in the road made me tense, expecting to see someone standing there. When I finally reached the paved road, I pulled over and sat there, shaking. Days later, I reported what happened. I told the local authorities about the footprints, the marks, the person in the trees. They said they would look into it. They said the area had occasional trespassers, sometimes people living off the grid, sometimes people who didn't want to be found. They said I was lucky nothing worse happened. I never went back to that cabin. Months passed, but the memory stayed with me. The silence, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched in a place where no one should have been. I still think about that figure sometimes, standing just inside the trees, waiting. I know now that the forest wasn't empty. It never was. I was the one who didn't belong there. I drove into the mountains in late fall, alone, with the kind of quiet excitement that comes from wanting to disappear for a while. I had rented a small, old cabin that sat deep in a national forest area, far from towns, far from cell service, far from other people. The listing said it was simple, old, and isolated. That was exactly what I wanted. I was tired of noise, tired of people, tired of always watching my back in the city in ways that felt loud and constant. I wanted silence, trees, and cold air. The road leading to the cabin was long and narrow, mostly dirt, with deep ruts from trucks and runoff from rain. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, tall and dark, their branches reaching toward the road like fingers. The sky was low and gray, heavy with clouds that looked like they might drop snow later. My tires crunched over gravel and fallen needles, and the sound echoed inside the car louder than I expected. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was crossing some invisible line, leaving normal life behind. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The cabin sat alone near the edge of a tree line, built from rough logs darkened by age and weather. The roof was metal and rusted in places. One small window faced the front, and another on the side. The front porch sagged slightly, its boards worn smooth by years of boots and rain. There was no other structure nearby, no other cabins, no lights in the distance, just trees and quiet. I parked my car off to the side and stepped out. The air was cold and sharp, filling my lungs in a way that felt clean but almost painful. It smelled like damp earth, pine sap, and old leaves. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, then went silent. The quiet felt thick, like it had weight. I grabbed my bags and walked up to the cabin, my boots thudding against the porch. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a couch that had seen better days. A wood stove sat against the far wall, blackened from use. There was a small bedroom in the back and a bathroom barely bigger than a closet. Everything smelled like dust, old wood, and cold air that had been trapped inside for too long. I dropped my bags and walked through each room slowly, checking corners, looking under the bed, opening the bathroom door. It was an old habit, something I did without thinking. I locked the door behind me when I was done, sliding the deadbolt into place. The sound was solid and comforting. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. I stacked firewood near the stove and got a fire going, feeding kindling and logs until flames caught and the stove began to tick and pop as it warmed. The sound of the fire filled the cabin, pushing back some of the silence. I made a simple meal on the small stove, ate it at the table, and watched the light outside fade through the window until the forest turned into a wall of black shapes. That first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where every small sound feels louder than it should. The wind moved through the trees, making branches rub together. Sometimes something moved in the underbrush outside, probably a deer or some small animal, but each sound made my muscles tense. I reminded myself that I was safe, that this was normal, that this was why people came out here. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I went to bed. I slept lightly, waking often. Every time I opened my eyes, the darkness felt heavy. The cabin creaked as it cooled, wood shifting with soft pops. Once, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I listened more closely, it was just the wind pushing something across the porch. I eventually fell into a deeper sleep as exhaustion took over. The next morning, I woke to pale light filtering through the bedroom window. The forest outside was still and quiet, covered in a thin layer of frost. I got dressed, made coffee, and stepped outside. My breath came out in white clouds. The clearing around the cabin looked untouched, smooth earth with scattered leaves. No tire tracks other than mine. No footprints, just stillness. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, staying within a few miles of the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, roots and rocks hidden under leaves. I saw animal tracks, heard birds, and once spotted a deer moving between trees. It felt peaceful in a raw, honest way. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, tired but calm. That evening, while gathering more firewood from a stack near the back of the cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. One of the logs had been moved. I was sure of it. The stack looked slightly disturbed, like someone had taken a piece and put it back wrong. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, telling myself I was overthinking. The wind could have knocked something loose. I could have bumped it earlier. Still, a small knot formed in my stomach. Inside, I locked the door again and kept the fire going longer than I needed to. I ate, read a bit, and tried to relax. Night came quickly again. The forest outside felt closer somehow, pressing in against the cabin walls. I went to bed with the same uneasy feeling I had brushed off earlier. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was dark, the fire long gone. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Faint sound outside, slow and deliberate, not the random movement of an animal. It sounded like footsteps on dirt. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, slow, heavy steps circling. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer, but the rhythm felt wrong. Too steady, too careful. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. I heard a soft scrape against the porch, like something brushing against the wood. Then silence. I lay there, frozen, staring at the dark ceiling. Minutes passed. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep, though it was shallow and full of tension. In the morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The frost had returned overnight, leaving the ground pale and crunchy under my boots. Near the porch, I saw footprints. Human footprints. They were large, the tread pattern clear in the frost. They led from the tree line to the porch, then back again, disappearing into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My mouth felt dry. My first thought was that someone had wandered by, maybe another hiker, maybe someone lost. But the cabin was far from any main trail. The footprints didn't wander. They went straight to the porch, then straight back. I checked my car. Nothing was touched. No broken windows. No signs of tampering. That didn't make me feel better. It made it worse. Whoever had been there hadn't wanted my car. They had wanted the cabin. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving out. But part of me didn't want to panic. I told myself it could have been the property owner checking on the place. Maybe a ranger. But there had been no notice. No sound of a vehicle. Just footsteps in the night. I decided to stay one more day, but I stayed close to the cabin. I kept my phone on me even though there was no service. I kept the door locked. I checked the windows often. That afternoon, while sitting at the table, I noticed something else. The side window had a smear on it, faint but visible in the light, like a handprint that had been wiped away. I leaned closer. The smudge was at about head height. Someone had been standing there, looking in. My chest tightened. The cabin suddenly felt very small. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every sound outside made me flinch. I kept the fire going even during the day, just to have the sound and warmth. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and a heavy piece of firewood nearby. The hours dragged on. The wind picked up, rattling branches. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, heavier. They came up onto the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I heard breathing, slow and steady, just on the other side of the door. Something brushed against the handle. It didn't turn, just touched, like someone testing it. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The minutes stretched out painfully. Eventually, the steps moved away, fading back into the forest. I didn't move for a long time after that. When morning finally came, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into bags. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I just wanted to leave. Before I did, I walked around the cabin one last time. Near the back, I found a spot where the ground was disturbed, leaves pushed aside. Someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. The forest seemed darker now, more closed in. Every bend in the road made my heart jump, half expecting someone to step out in front of me. But the drive out was quiet. When I finally reached a place with cell service, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, shaking, letting the tension drain out of me. I reported what happened to the rental company and local authorities. They said they would look into it. I never heard back. Weeks later, safe at home, the memories still feel sharp. The quiet, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched in a place where no one was supposed to be. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know that the cabin was not as empty as I believed, and that leaving when I did was the reason I am still alive. I went to the cabin because I needed quiet. That was the only reason. I told myself that many times before I left. I had been working nonstop for months, barely sleeping, eating badly, always looking at screens. I felt worn down in a way that sleep at home did not fix. The cabin was something I had owned for years but rarely used. It sat deep in the woods, far from towns, down a long dirt road that most people never noticed. There was no cell service there. No neighbors, just trees, dirt, and weather. The drive took most of the day. The road turned from pavement to gravel and then to packed dirt with deep ruts. Branches scraped the sides of my truck. Dust hung in the air behind me and settled on the windshield whenever I slowed down. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, my shoulders were tight and my head ached. I shut off the engine and sat there for a while, listening to the ticking sound as the metal cooled. The cabin looked the same as always. Old wood darkened by rain and time. A small porch with one step sagging slightly, the roof patched in places with mismatched shingles. It was not a pretty cabin, but it was solid, built decades ago, long before I bought it. Tall trees surrounded it on all sides, close enough that even during the day the light felt muted, filtered through leaves and branches. The air smelled like pine, damp soil, and old wood. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell inside was stronger. Dust, stale air, a hint of mouse droppings that I would need to clean later. I opened the windows to let air move through. Sunlight cut into the room in thin lines. The cabin was one room with a small sleeping area in the back, a table, a wood stove, and shelves along the walls. Everything was simple. Everything was quiet. I spent the first hour cleaning, sweeping the floor, wiping the table, checking the corners for nests. I moved slowly, not rushing. My body felt heavy, like it was still carrying the city with it. Once I finished, I unpacked food, water, and tools. I stacked firewood by the stove even though it was not cold yet. Old habits. The first night passed without anything strange. I cooked, ate, and sat on the porch as the sky darkened. The woods grew louder as insects started up. I could hear distant animals moving through brush. Nothing unusual. I went inside when it got dark, lit a lantern, and lay down. The bed creaked softly under my weight. Sleep came slow but steady. The second day was calm too. I walked the property line in the morning, checking for fallen trees or damage. The ground was soft in places, still wet from rain earlier in the week. I noticed animal tracks near the edge of the clearing. Deer, most likely. Maybe something smaller. Again, nothing unusual. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first thing that felt off. I had gone inside to get water, and when I came back out, I saw marks in the dirt near the porch. At first, I thought they were my own footprints. I knelt down to look closer. They were not mine. They were larger, heavier. The shape was wrong for boots, too wide in the front. The dirt around them was pressed deep, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a while. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a bear had come close during the night. That was possible out here. I had seen bears before, though never right up to the porch. I scanned the tree line. Everything looked normal. The woods were still, quiet in that way that does not feel peaceful, just empty. I brushed the thought away and went back inside. That night, I woke up suddenly. No sound had pulled me from sleep, but my body was tense, heart beating fast. The lantern was off. The cabin was dark except for moonlight through the windows. I lay still, listening. I heard nothing at first. Then I heard a soft noise outside. Not footsteps, more like something shifting weight, leaves brushing against something solid. I stayed in bed, eyes open, breathing slow. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I waited longer, then longer still. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. The next morning, I found more marks, this time closer to the windows. The dirt beneath the glass was disturbed. I could see where something had pressed near the wall. There were smears on the lower part of the wood, like something had leaned there. I ran my fingers over the marks. The wood felt rough, splintered slightly where pressure had been applied. My stomach tightened. I checked the area carefully. No clear tracks leading away, just disturbed ground that blended back into forest floor. It felt deliberate, though I could not explain why. I considered leaving. The thought crossed my mind clearly, but I dismissed it just as clearly. Fear makes everything feel bigger than it is. That is what I told myself. I stayed. Over the next 2 days, small things kept happening. Items I was sure I had placed in one spot seemed slightly moved. A chair angled differently. A tool not exactly where I remembered setting it down. Each time I blamed my own memory. I was tired, out of routine, alone. But the feeling did not go away. On the 5th night, I heard it again. Louder this time. Something walking slowly around the cabin. Not circling fast. Not sneaking. Just steady, heavy movement. Leaves crunching under weight. The sound stopped near the back wall. I could hear breathing then. Low and slow. Not an animal panting. Measured breaths. I did not move. I did not reach for anything. I lay there staring into the darkness, counting my breaths, waiting for the sound to fade. It did not. The breathing stayed for a long time, so long that my muscles began to ache from tension. Eventually, it moved away. The steps faded into the trees. I did not sleep after that. The first light, I checked the cabin carefully. The back wall had fresh marks, scratches in the wood. Not deep gouges, but long, uneven lines, at about shoulder height, too high for most animals. I stood there staring at them, my mind trying to force logic into place. I packed some things into my truck. I told myself I would leave after one more day. Just one more. I wanted daylight for the drive. That day felt wrong from the start. The woods were too quiet. No birds. No insects. The air felt thick, heavy. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept looking toward the tree line, expecting movement. Near sunset, I noticed something else. A place where the ground was worn down into a shallow depression a short distance from the cabin. Like someone had been standing there repeatedly, watching. That night, I locked the door and barred it with a heavy piece of wood I used for firewood splitting. I moved the table against it. I turned off the lantern and sat in darkness. The steps came earlier this time. Close, direct. They stopped right at the door. I could hear breathing again, louder now. I could smell something through the cracks in the wood. A sour, human smell mixed with sweat and dirt. The door shifted slightly, pressure against it. Not a hard push, just testing. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Then the pressure returned, stronger. The wood creaked. Dust fell from the frame. I held my breath. My hands shook. I thought the door would give, but it didn't. Eventually, the pressure stopped. The steps moved away, slowly, calmly. I stayed awake until morning. When light came, I opened the door carefully. Outside, I saw clear footprints leading away. Human footprints, barefoot, large. The toes splayed slightly, as if the person walked without shoes often. They led deeper into the woods. I left immediately. The drive felt endless. Every sound from the truck made me flinch. Every shadow between trees looked like movement. When I finally reached pavement, I did not slow down. I never went back. Weeks later, I returned with local authorities. They found a rough shelter in the woods. Old cans, cloth scraps, signs someone had been living there for a long time. Watching, they told me it was likely a transient who had been using the area for years. Someone who avoided towns. Someone who had grown used to being unseen. The cabin was removed from the property not long after. Burned down safely, cleared away. The land was sold. What stays with me is not fear of the woods. It is the understanding that isolation does not mean empty. Sometimes it just means you are the only one who does not belong there. And sometimes you are being watched long before you ever notice. I went to the cabin because I needed quiet. That was the honest reason, even if I did not fully understand how deep that need was until I was already there. My life before that trip had become loud in a way that never stopped. Phones buzzing, engines outside, people moving around me all the time. Even when I was alone, I felt watched by schedules and responsibilities. The cabin was supposed to fix that. It was an old hunting cabin I found through a local listing, sitting deep in state land where the gravel road stopped being smooth and started turning into loose rock and dirt. No neighbors, no cell service, no cameras. No noise except wind and animals. I told myself that isolation was the point. The drive took almost 7 hours. The last 2 were the hardest. The paved road ended and my car bounced slowly over ruts and stones. Tall trees closed in on both sides, blocking out the sky. The light changed from open daylight to a dull green shade, like everything was underwater. I remember thinking how easy it would be to miss a turn or get stuck out there. I also remember not caring. I wanted to be cut off. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos, which somehow made it worse. Old wood walls that had faded gray from years of rain and sun. A slanted tin roof with rust stains running down the sides. A small porch with one step missing, leaving a gap I had to step over. The windows were narrow and dark, and the front door leaned slightly inward like it had been pushed too many times. The place looked tired. Not abandoned, but worn down by time and weather. It felt like a place that had seen people come and go without remembering any of them. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, cold metal, and something faintly sour like damp fabric that never fully dried. The inside was one main room with a small kitchen corner, a table, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a wood stove against the far wall. There was a short hallway that led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. Everything was simple and old, but clean enough. No power lines ran to the cabin. There were lanterns, a propane stove, and a stack of firewood by the wall. I dropped my bags and stood still for a while. The silence felt heavy. Not peaceful yet, just heavy. My ears rang slightly, trying to adjust. Outside, the forest pressed close. The trees were thick and tall, their trunks dark and straight. Their branches tangled together so tightly that the ground stayed shaded even in the middle of the day. I spent the first afternoon unpacking and getting settled. I brought enough food for 10 days, more than I planned to stay just in case. Canned goods, dried food, bottled water, and some fresh things in a cooler. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, not because I was scared yet, but because that was something I always did in a new place. Everything worked, even if it felt old. That night came fast. Once the sun dropped behind the trees, the forest went dark in a way that cities never do. I lit a lantern and made a simple meal. The light only reached a few feet around me, leaving the corners of the cabin in shadow. Every small sound felt louder. The pop of the wood stove, the scrape of my boots on the floor, the wind moving through the trees outside, making a low, rushing sound that never fully stopped. When I went to bed, I slept poorly. The mattress was thin and the room felt colder than I expected. Every now and then, I woke up for no clear reason. My body tensed like it was listening for something. Each time, I told myself it was just the new environment. Animals, wind, branches brushing the cabin. Normal things. The next morning, I felt better. Sunlight filtered through the trees and slipped through the narrow windows, making thin lines of light across the floor. I made breakfast and stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The air was cold and sharp, clean in a way that made my lungs feel wide open. Birds moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, something larger moved through the underbrush, slow and heavy. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was no real trail, just signs that people had walked there before. Flattened grass, broken twigs, old boot prints half filled with dirt and leaves. I stayed close, never letting the cabin fully disappear from view. I noticed things I had not seen the day before. A stack of old firewood farther back in the trees, more than I would need. A rusted metal barrel tipped over near a shallow dip in the ground. Old signs of use, but no sign of recent activity. That night, I heard something that made me pause. It was late. I had been reading by lantern light when I noticed a sound that did not fit with the rest. It was not the wind, not the random snap of branches. It was rhythmic, soft but steady, like something moving carefully step by step on dry leaves. I froze and listened. The sound came from somewhere behind the cabin. I told myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe. They move quietly, but not silently. The sound lasted for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I waited longer, heart beating faster than I liked. Nothing else happened. I slept even worse that night. Over the next few days, the feeling of being alone started to crack. I would find small changes around the cabin that I could not fully explain. Firewood stacked slightly differently than I remembered. The cooler lid not shut the way I always closed it. Footprints near the edge of the clearing that did not match my boots. Each time I tried to reason it out. I could have forgotten. Wind and animals could move things. My memory could be wrong. Still, I started locking the door even during the day. On the fourth night, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. They moved slowly, stopping often, like whoever or whatever it was did not want to make noise. I stayed still, lantern off, sitting in the dark. My breathing felt loud in my chest. I waited for the sound to move away. It did not. It circled the cabin once, the steps moving across dirt, then wood, then leaves again. I could tell where it was by the change in sound. After a long time, it stopped near the front of the cabin. I did not hear the door handle move. I did not hear knocking, just stillness, heavy, watching stillness. Eventually, the sound moved away again, fading back into the forest. I did not sleep at all after that. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with a tight feeling in my stomach. I found clear footprints in a muddy patch near the back. Human footprints. Large, heavy, worn boots. They were not mine. They pointed toward the cabin and then away from it. I stood there staring at them, my mind racing through possibilities. A hiker passing through. A hunter. Someone lost. But no one had a reason to be there. That was when I noticed something else. A small pile of cigarette butts near the tree line. Fresh. I did not smoke. From that moment on, fear became constant. Not panic, but a deep, steady awareness that I was not alone out there. I considered leaving, but part of me hesitated. The car was a long walk away through rough ground. Leaving meant committing to hours of travel through isolated roads. Staying felt safer during daylight. I told myself I would leave the next morning. That night was worse than the others. The footsteps came earlier, just after dark. They moved with more confidence now. Faster, heavier. At one point, something brushed against the side of the cabin, making the wall creak softly. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, holding a flashlight and a small hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. My hands shook no matter how hard I tried to steady them. Then I heard the sound of breathing. It was faint, almost lost in the noise of the forest, but it was there. Slow, controlled breaths, close to the window near the couch. I stayed frozen, every muscle tight, waiting for something worse to happen. Minutes stretched out like hours. Finally, the breathing moved away. When morning came, I packed everything. I did not eat. I did not clean. I threw my things into my bags with shaking hands. When I stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints right up to the porch. I followed them with my eyes into the trees. They did not lead away this time. They circled the cabin multiple times, overlapping, worn deep into the dirt. Someone had been there all night. I walked to my car fast, not running, but close. Every sound made me flinch. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone stepping out from behind a tree. The forest felt different now. Smaller, closer, like it was closing in on me. I reached the car and got inside. My hands fumbled with the keys before the engine finally turned over. I did not relax until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. I reported the incident later, once I reached an area with cell service. Authorities checked the site. They found signs of someone living nearby. A makeshift camp hidden less than half a mile from the cabin. Food wrappers, bedding, tools. No one was found, but it was clear someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. I never went back. The ending was not dramatic. No chase, no final confrontation. Just the slow understanding that I had stepped into someone else's space without knowing it, and that my presence had been noticed immediately. The fear stayed with me long after I left. Even now, when I think about that cabin, what scares me most is not what almost happened, but how easily it could have happened without anyone ever knowing. The forest did not care. The cabin did not protect me. And the silence I went there to find was never empty at all. I went to the cabin because I wanted to disappear for a while. Not in a dramatic way, not because of some big event, but because everything in my life had started to feel loud and crowded in a way that did not stop even when I was alone. The cabin sat on a piece of land that belonged to my uncle, far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and long stretches of uneven ground that had never been leveled. The drive there took hours after the last gas station, and the final stretch was nothing but a narrow dirt road with deep tire ruts and loose stones that popped under the wheels. By the time I arrived, my hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel, and my shoulders felt locked in place. The cabin itself was small, older than it looked in pictures, built with dark wood that had faded unevenly from years of weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch leaned just enough to make walking on it feel uncertain. The place smelled like dust, dry wood, and old air the moment I opened the door. No electricity except a small generator, no phone signal, no neighbors for miles. I liked that. At least I thought I did. The first day passed quietly. I unloaded supplies, stacked canned food on the counter, filled jugs with water from the hand pump outside, and checked the locks on the doors and windows out of habit more than fear. The forest around the cabin was dense, with tall trees packed so close together that sunlight struggled to reach the ground in some places. Everything felt still, like the land was holding its breath. That night I slept hard, the kind of sleep that comes from physical exhaustion and silence. The wind moved through the trees outside, brushing against the cabin in soft waves. The walls creaked now and then, the normal sounds of an old structure settling. Nothing felt wrong. The second day was when small things started to feel off, though I could not have explained why if someone had asked. The forest felt different when I stepped outside that morning. Not dangerous, not threatening, just quieter than it should have been. Birds were present, but fewer than I expected. The air felt heavy, thick in my chest. I spent the day clearing fallen branches from around the cabin and walking the immediate area to get familiar with the land. I noticed old footprints in the dirt near the tree line, partially washed away by rain but still visible in places. I told myself they could be from anyone. Hunters passed through this land sometimes. Hikers too. That explanation should have been enough, but it stayed in my head longer than it needed to. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows again, more carefully than the night before. I did not feel scared exactly, just alert, like my body had decided something required attention even if my mind had not caught up yet. I slept lighter, waking up several times to the sound of branches snapping in the distance. Each time, I waited, listening, until my heart slowed again. On the third day, I found the first thing that made my stomach drop. It was a piece of food wrapper near the back of the cabin, tucked close to the wall where leaves had gathered. It was not mine. I checked my supplies immediately, counting items, looking for anything missing. Everything was still there. The wrapper looked old, sun-faded, but not destroyed. Someone had been there at some point, close enough to the cabin to leave trash behind. I spent a long time standing in the yard, slowly turning in place, scanning the trees. The forest looked the same as it always had. Quiet, dense, watching without eyes. I told myself the land was not private in the strictest sense. People wandered through remote areas all the time. That did not mean someone was still nearby. Still, I moved the generator inside that evening and kept a flashlight next to me at all times. The next few days blurred together in a slow, uneasy rhythm. I noticed things that could have been nothing but felt like something. Small piles of disturbed dirt near the tree line. A log that had been dragged closer to the cabin than before. The sound of footsteps that stopped when I stopped moving. Each time there was a logical explanation. Animals, wind, my imagination feeding on isolation. But the feeling did not go away. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the shadows stretched long across the ground, I noticed movement near the trees. Just a shape partially hidden, still enough that I might have missed it if I had not already been watching the area. It did not move like an animal. It shifted weight slowly, deliberately, as if whoever it was knew staying still mattered. I froze where I stood, every muscle tight. I did not run. I did not move closer. I simply watched, waiting for proof that I was wrong. After a long time, the shape slipped back into the trees, silent and careful. That night, I did not sleep. I sat inside the cabin with the lights off, listening. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. My breathing sounded wrong to my own ears. The forest outside creaked and whispered, but underneath it all was the sense of something deliberate, something controlled. At one point, I heard footsteps on the ground outside, slow and measured, circling the cabin without ever coming close enough to touch the walls. Whoever it was knew exactly how far to stay to remain unseen. Morning came eventually, pale and thin. I waited until full daylight before stepping outside. The ground around the cabin was marked with fresh footprints. They were clear, deep, unmistakably human. They circled the structure once, then led away toward the north, disappearing into the trees. I packed my things that morning, Not in a panic, not rushing, but with the steady understanding that staying longer would be a mistake. I loaded the car and made one last walk around the cabin to be sure nothing was left behind. That was when I found the place near the back where the ground had been cleared just enough to lie down. Leaves pushed aside, dirt flattened, a small depression shaped by repeated use. Someone had been sleeping there. The realization settled in slowly, like cold water soaking into fabric. Whoever had been watching me had not just passed through. They had stayed. They had learned my routines. They had waited. I left immediately. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every bend in the road made me tense, expecting to see someone standing in the middle of it. Nothing happened. The forest swallowed the cabin behind me, and eventually the dirt road gave way to pavement. I reported what I found when I reached town. The response was measured, cautious. The land was remote. There were people who lived off-grid, people who avoided contact. Patrols were rare. They said they would check the area. Weeks passed. I tried to put it behind me. Then I received a call informing me they had found signs of a long-term camp not far from the cabin. Makeshift bedding, food cans, tools. No person present. No identification. Whoever it was had vanished deeper into the wilderness. The cabin remains unused now. I will not go back. What stays with me is not the fear of what could have happened, but the understanding of how easily it almost did. How close I came to sharing space with someone who never announced themselves, never spoke, never showed their face. Someone who chose to watch instead. Out there, silence does not mean emptiness. Sometimes it means you are not alone, and whoever is nearby is simply better at staying quiet than you are. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours when I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The sun had dipped low, spilling red and gold over the trees, and I could see the shadows lengthening along the uneven ground. I had rented this cabin for a week, seeking solitude and quiet, away from the endless buzz of the city and the constant noise of other people's lives. I liked the idea of being alone in the woods, just the way I could manage. I had never done anything like this before, never been entirely alone in such a remote place, but something about the isolation felt necessary, almost cleansing. The road was rough, pitted with holes and lined with overgrown bushes that scraped against the sides of my car as I drove slowly. Every so often, the tires would hit a loose rock or a patch of mud, jostling me slightly. I had checked my map multiple times before leaving, making sure I had the right turnoffs, but now, as I drove deeper, I realized that the map might not have captured the small twists and forks that had developed over the years. The GPS on my phone flickered in and out, the signal weak among the dense trees and hills. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin sitting quietly among the tall pines. It was smaller than I had imagined. A simple wooden structure, dark brown and weathered. The roof was covered in a thin layer of moss, and the windows reflected the last light of the day like dark mirrors. A narrow path, just wide enough for a single car, led to the cabin, and the ground around it was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. The air smelled sharp and clean, with a faint scent of damp wood and earth. I parked my car in the small clearing beside the cabin and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. There were no birds singing, no wind stirring the trees, just a thick, almost heavy quiet. I pulled my backpack from the trunk and carried it to the cabin, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. I noticed that the cabin's door was slightly ajar. I remembered the rental instructions saying it would be locked, but maybe the previous visitor had left it open. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door gently. It creaked as it moved, the sound echoing in the empty interior. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area to my left, a living space with a low wooden table in the center, and a loft above that I assumed held the sleeping area. I set my backpack down and began unpacking, placing my food and supplies on the counter. I noticed the cabin was furnished sparsely but adequately. A few chairs, a small couch, a wood stove, and a few shelves lined the walls. There was a pile of chopped wood near the stove and a bucket of water sitting by the sink. I spent the next hour settling in, lighting the stove and organizing my things. The sky outside had grown darker, and the shadows of the trees pressed against the windows. I stood at the doorway, looking out at the woods, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted, but already there was a sense of unfamiliarity that made me alert. Every crack of a branch outside, every distant rustle of leaves, sounded sharper and closer than it should have. As night fell completely, I lit a lantern and moved through the cabin, checking that everything was in order. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washing it down with some water. The silence was constant, heavy, and I found myself listening for it, trying to find rhythm in the quiet. Occasionally, I thought I heard something outside. A distant rustle, the snap of a branch, a faint thump against the ground. Each time, I would pause and wait, straining my ears, but the sound would vanish, leaving only the quiet. The first night was the hardest. I lay in the loft, wrapped in blankets, feeling the old wooden floor beneath me, hearing every creak and groan of the cabin as it settled. Occasionally, I would hear what I thought was someone walking outside, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs, but when I went to look, there was nothing. My imagination ran wild. I could almost convince myself that someone was watching, that I wasn't alone. But eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep, light and fitful, waking every few hours to the sounds outside. The next morning, I woke to fog drifting through the trees. The entire clearing was muted, the cabin sitting in a gray haze. I made coffee on the stove, breathing in the scent of the hot liquid, and stepped outside to inspect the area. The fog muffled sound and distorted shapes. I walked the small perimeter around the cabin, checking the woodpile and the surrounding forest. Everything seemed normal, yet I could not shake the feeling of being observed. Small things stood out. A tree branch that looked as though it had been broken recently, a patch of disturbed ground near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was likely an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but my stomach twisted with unease. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I would wake early, chop wood for the stove, prepare my meals, and explore the surrounding forest during daylight. Each walk brought its own tension. The trees were dense, the underbrush thick, and the forest floor uneven. I kept to the main paths I could see from the cabin, but I often found that the terrain was unpredictable. At times, I would hear the rustle of bushes, the snap of twigs, or the distant sound of something moving quickly, just beyond sight. I saw no animals at first, only traces. Footprints in the mud, droppings, broken branches. One afternoon, I ventured further than usual, following a small stream that meandered through the forest. The sound of water was comforting, masking the other noises around me. I paused to examine the stream, crouching to run my fingers through the cool water, when I noticed something that made my heart stop. On the opposite bank, a figure of sorts stood partially hidden among the trees. At first, I thought it was a fallen log or a large bush, but then it shifted slightly, a subtle movement that was too deliberate to be natural. My breath caught and I froze. The figure did not come closer or move away. It simply watched or seemed to. I did not stay long. I retraced my steps quickly, heart pounding, convincing myself it was an illusion, the trick of light and shadow. But after that day, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every time I left the cabin, I had the sense that something was tracking me, always just out of sight. I would see glimpses of movement in the corner of my eyes. Shadows shifting among the trees, branches swaying without wind, footprints that seemed fresh yet not like any animal I recognized. One evening, I returned to the cabin after a long walk, carrying a small bag of firewood. I had noticed more broken branches along the path, and the undergrowth seemed more disturbed than usual. As I approached the cabin, I froze. My car was gone. The small clearing, which I had checked every day, was empty. Panic surged through me. I ran to the cabin and checked the doors. They were still locked, just as I had left them. My backpack was untouched. Whoever had taken my car had either waited for me to return or had followed me. I realized then that the feeling of being watched was not just in my head. I spent the night inside the cabin, sleeping fitfully, listening to every sound outside. The darkness was complete, and the shadows of the trees pressed against the windows like walls. I could hear distant noises, the crunch of footsteps in leaves, the snap of twigs, the faint whisper of movement through the forest. I did not sleep much. I stayed alert, keeping my lantern close and the stove burning, making a small fire in case I needed to defend myself. The next morning, I decided I could not stay. I needed to leave before it got worse. I had no car, and the nearest town was miles away, through forested roads I had never walked before. I gathered supplies: water, canned food, a first aid kit, and my backpack. I also found a small hatchet in the cabin just in case. I tried to remember the path I had taken on my way in, but the forest seemed different now, denser, more confusing. I left the cabin carefully, moving through the trees, staying alert to every sound. The forest was silent for a while, then filled with occasional noises. Rustling in the underbrush, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I moved quickly but cautiously, marking the trees with scratches of my hatchet to avoid getting lost. Hours passed, and the forest remained thick and unyielding. At one point, I found a small abandoned logging trail. It was muddy and uneven but seemed to lead in the direction I needed. I followed it, hoping it would eventually take me to a road. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of a dirt road. Relief surged through me, and I moved toward it as quickly as possible. As I neared the road, I saw a lone car parked by the side. I ran to it shouting, but there was no one there. I hesitated, then realized it was a good place to rest and plan my next move. I stayed there until nightfall, keeping watch and listening to the forest. The next morning, a local drove by on the road and stopped when they saw me. I explained my situation as best I could, and they agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I learned from the rental service that the previous visitors had reported stolen vehicles and strange disturbances in the area. The cabin itself was frequently empty, with people avoiding it after similar experiences. Looking back, I realized how easily isolation can warp perception and heighten fear. I had been careful, but the wilderness is unpredictable, and human threats, as well as the unknown movements of animals or other people, can create a terror far more real than any story. The experience left me wary and more aware of the subtle dangers in solitude, and I promised myself never to underestimate the weight of quiet, the pressure of darkness, or the consequences of being truly alone in a place where no one can reach you. I remember the moment I decided to go. The idea of a weekend in a remote cabin in the mountains seemed simple at first, almost cliché. I wanted to escape the constant noise of the city, the emails, the calls, the never-ending hum of life. I found the cabin online, a small wooden structure deep in the forests of the northern range, far from any town, far from any road, reachable only by a narrow, winding dirt trail that hadn't seen a car in years. The pictures online made it seem cozy, isolated in a way that suggested privacy without danger. There were no other structures visible, no neighbors peeking from windows, no fences to hint at human presence. Just trees, snow-capped mountains, and a clear lake not far from the cabin. It seemed perfect. I drove through the early morning fog, the kind that clung to the edges of the road like wet cotton. The GPS struggled to keep a signal past the small town at the base of the mountains, and I relied more on instinct than technology after that. The dirt path turned into a rutted track, with rocks jutting up like teeth from the earth, and my tires crunched over them with every careful turn. Every now and then, I glimpsed an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, darting into the trees. There was something calming about that first hour, the isolation settling over me like a blanket. I parked my car near the clearing the cabin was supposed to be in, and from a distance, the structure appeared smaller than the pictures suggested. That feeling of minor disappointment was the first small discomfort I ignored, telling myself that the real charm would come when I was inside, alone. The cabin was older than I expected. Its wooden planks were weathered, faded by sun and rain, but solid. There was a small porch with a railing that creaked when I stepped on it. The windows were dusty, the glass warped slightly with age. I unlocked the door, feeling a strange, subtle tension as I pushed it open. The interior smelled of wood polish that had long since dried and a faint mustiness of closed air. There was a small living area with a fireplace, a kitchen corner with a few utensils, and a tiny bedroom toward the back. Everything seemed serviceable, nothing modern or luxurious, but I had brought my own sleeping bag and food, so I didn't mind. I set my bag down on the bed, took a deep breath, and felt that brief thrill of isolation, the feeling of being completely alone in the world, surrounded by forest. The first night was quiet in ways that made me uncomfortable. In the city, the silence was an absence of sound. Here, silence was presence. I could hear the soft rustle of trees against each other, the faint drip of water somewhere nearby, and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of something moving over dry leaves. My mind tried to rationalize it. Small animals, maybe a raccoon, maybe a fox, but even that sounded too close, too deliberate. I fell asleep eventually, or at least I thought I did, because I woke several times, heart racing, listening to noises that never seemed to stop entirely. The next day, I explored the surroundings. The trail I had parked on led to a lake, just as the listing had promised. The water was clear, unnaturally still. I walked along its edge, noticing how the reflection of the trees made it hard to distinguish the water from the land. The forest was dense, and I had no idea how far it stretched. As I wandered, I started to realize that the cabin wasn't as isolated as the pictures suggested. There were old tracks in the mud, tire marks from some time in the last week, footprints that didn't match my own. They disappeared into the trees, and I followed them for a while, curiosity getting the better of me. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. There was no sign of life, no houses, no hunters' cabins, nothing. Just the quiet that felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I turned back, convincing myself it was just other hikers, or maybe someone who had stayed near the lake before me. That night, I built a fire in the cabin's fireplace. The dry wood hissed and popped as the flames grew, and I sat staring into it for hours. The forest outside seemed alive, shifting with shadows that the firelight could not reach. I kept thinking I saw movement beyond the windows, just at the edges of my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. I checked the locks on the doors, the windows, even though I had no reason to believe anyone would come near. The paranoia was creeping in, subtle but steady. By the time I fell asleep, the fire had gone out, leaving the cabin in darkness so complete that I could barely see my hands in front of me. The third day, I decided to leave the cabin for a hike along a nearby ridge. I wanted to see the mountains from above, to prove to myself that I wasn't entirely alone, that the world outside my little clearing was real. The trail was overgrown, and my boots slipped over rocks and wet roots. About an hour in, I heard voices, or at least I thought I did. Far off, muffled, indistinct. My chest tightened. I paused, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. No birds, no humans, no movement except the wind. I kept going, trying to tell myself it was my imagination. Maybe the sound of water echoing in the valley below, but the unease stuck with me. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, and the shadows seemed longer than they should be. That night, the fear became tangible. I was making a simple dinner when I heard it, the sound of the door handle rattling. My stomach dropped. I had double-checked the locks before I started cooking. I froze, listening. It stopped. Then, a soft scraping like a fingernail against wood. My first thought was an animal, but the sound didn't match any animal I knew. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I had brought a pocket knife with me, small but sturdy, and I gripped it tightly. Every rustle outside made me jump. Couldn't sleep at all that night. Every small noise, branches cracking, leaves brushing against the windows, the wind shifting, felt like it meant someone was outside, watching. I thought of calling the local police, but I didn't know my exact location. Cell signal was spotty at best. I realized that in this isolation, I was almost entirely vulnerable. The following morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. Larger than mine, heavy, deliberate, circling the building. My stomach churned. Whoever had been here had been watching me. Maybe someone had followed me from the road. Maybe they lived in the forest. The rational part of my mind tried to calm me. Maybe a hiker had come in the night, but the tracks were too close to the windows, too careful. There was no sign of animals doing this. I packed essentials, filling my bag with food, water, and the knife. I left my car keys, intending to hike to the nearest road rather than risk being followed on the drive. The decision made me tense, my heart pounding with every step I took down the trail. As I descended, the forest seemed to close in, the trees bending overhead like silent observers. I kept checking behind me. The tracks I had seen outside the cabin were nowhere on the trail, but that did little to calm me. Every rock that cracked under my boot, every branch that snapped too sharply, made me think someone was trying to follow, silent and deliberate. I considered climbing higher to find a view of the valley, maybe spot a road or cars, but the ridge I had hoped to reach was steep, covered with loose rocks, and dangerous if I wasn't fully alert. Fear sharpened my senses, made each step calculated, each movement deliberate. By the time I reached a small clearing with a view of the distant highway, dusk was settling. I could see a faint line of cars, tiny against the landscape. Relief washed over me. Civilization existed. I was not as alone as I had feared. I hurried toward the highway, trying to find a descent path that wouldn't be noticeable to anyone in the woods but would get me down safely. I reached the road at nightfall, exhausted, covered in scratches from branches and rocks, dehydrated but alive. Passing car noticed me, slowed, and I flagged it down. The driver looked concerned but didn't ask questions, just let me get in. I told them my situation as best I could, and they drove me to the nearest town. The police met me there. They searched the area around the cabin the next day. There were signs of someone having been there. Footprints, broken branches, faint traces of a fire made near my cabin, but no one was found. They told me it might have been squatters or hikers who retreated deeper into the forest when they saw me leave. They warned me about staying in isolated areas without proper communication or backup. I realized then that the fear I had felt, the sense of being hunted, had been real, not imaginary. I had escaped it, but barely. I never went back to that cabin. The pictures still exist online, a harmless-looking retreat in the mountains. But I know better now. The forest is not always peaceful. Isolation can be dangerous, and there are people who know how to move unseen. The silence is not comforting. It is a warning. I think about that weekend often, about the sound of the handle rattling, about the shadows in the corners of the windows. It taught me a lesson about preparation, about vigilance, about how quickly calm can turn into fear in a place that seems empty but is never truly empty. I learned that being realistic about danger is as important as any escape plan, and that even when you survive, fear leaves a mark, a memory that never fades. I had been driving for hours along a winding, nearly abandoned forest road, the kind where the asphalt disappeared in patches and the trees pressed close on both sides, their branches weaving a dense canopy that let only thin streaks of light through. My plan was simple: spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin I had rented online. The pictures looked decent, and the description promised privacy, serenity, and a total escape from the noise of the city. I wanted quiet. I wanted nothing but the sound of wind in the trees, birds in the morning, and maybe a fire crackling at night. The last town had been small and sleepy, with a gas station that smelled faintly of diesel and fried food. I filled the tank just to be safe. The attendant, a man with tired eyes and a slow smile, had asked me if I was sure I wanted to take that road. I smiled back and nodded, brushing it off, but there was something in his tone, almost a warning, that stayed with me. The forest road started as gravel, deep ruts filled with rainwater, mud clinging to my tires as I drove slowly. With every mile, the trees grew thicker, the road narrower, and the feeling of isolation increased. My phone signal disappeared somewhere around the 10th mile. The GPS stubbornly tried to find me, spinning a small blue dot in endless circles on the screen. I didn't care. This was exactly the kind of detachment I had wanted. The cabin appeared suddenly after a bend. It was smaller than I had imagined, a single-story wooden structure with dark stains from years of weather. The windows were dusty, and the front steps creaked as I climbed them, each groan of the wood loud in the quiet forest. There was no other house in sight, no light in the distance, just trees. I parked my car beside the cabin and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The air smelled damp, earthy, with the faint trace of smoke from some distant, forgotten fire. Inside, the cabin was modest but livable. A small kitchen, a living area with a rickety couch, a wood stove, and a bedroom in the back. Dust coated the surfaces, and the smell of stale wood filled the space. I set down my bag and immediately started exploring, checking the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed old but functional. The electricity worked, barely, and the lights flickered when I turned them on. There was a small pile of firewood near the stove and kindling stacked in a corner. Perfect. I unpacked slowly, laying out my clothes and food supplies, taking note of the cabin's creaks and small quirks. The floors groaned under my weight, and the windows rattled slightly in the wind. It was quiet, but the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. My own breathing sounded loud. Outside, the forest was almost motionless, just occasional rustles as small animals moved among the trees. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood and stacking it neatly, making sure I would be warm at night. The sunlight faded quickly, the forest darkening to a deep green, then gray, then black. The first night was difficult. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the doors. I lit a fire in the stove and sat close to it, the warmth comforting, the light creating shadows that danced on the walls. Every small sound made me jump. The groan of a branch against the roof, the scurrying of some animal outside, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The forest seemed alive in a way I wasn't used to. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that the cabin just amplified every noise, that I was alone and safe. Around midnight, I noticed something, a faint light moving outside, just at the edge of the clearing, beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, my heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities. Hikers? No, unlikely at this hour. Hunters? Maybe, though it didn't feel right. Animals? But animals don't carry lights. The beam disappeared quickly, leaving me staring into darkness. I convinced myself it was probably a reflection, maybe from my flashlight outside, or even a trick of the firelight. I told myself to sleep, though sleep was impossible. The next morning, the forest looked peaceful, deceptive in its calm. I stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin, and walked around the cabin, looking for signs of anyone else. Nothing. No footprints in the mud. No discarded items. No sign that anyone had been there recently. I laughed at myself for worrying. The light last night had probably been nothing. As the day wore on, I set up my day's routine. Gathering firewood, hiking a short path near the cabin, checking the perimeter. The forest was dense, full of fallen logs and thick underbrush. It was easy to get disoriented, but I stayed close enough to the cabin to keep my bearings. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something unusual on one of the trees near the path. A mark carved into the bark. At first, I thought it was natural, some strange pattern in the wood. But as I looked closer, it was deliberate, an X, deep and jagged. I frowned. The mark was recent. The bark was still raw, dark sap oozing slightly. I felt a chill, more from the sudden awareness of being observed than from the cold. I checked around carefully, scanning the underbrush, but saw nothing. I returned to the cabin quickly, locking the doors behind me, heart racing, trying to rationalize. Maybe a local woodsman marked trees for firewood, or someone had been hiking recently. Nothing more. That night was worse. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, rattling the windows like a warning. I kept the fire roaring, but the shadows seemed thicker, moving differently than before. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined figures outside, watching from the darkness. Hours passed slowly, each creak of the cabin louder than the last. And then I heard it, footsteps, outside, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, soft, but heavy enough that they pressed into the wooden deck. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a flashlight, a hunting knife from my bag, and peered out the window. Darkness. Nothing. The footsteps returned, now from the back of the cabin, then the side, circling completely. My rational mind screamed at me to call someone, but there was no phone signal, no way to reach help. I remembered the man at the gas station, his warning tone echoing in my head. I spent the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand, listening to the forest, barely daring to breathe. When morning came, the light revealed no footprints, no sign of passage, only the X on the tree, stark and accusing in the daylight. Over the next day, I did everything I could to feel safe. I barricaded the doors with furniture, placed heavy logs against the windows, and kept the fire burning. I moved cautiously outside only to check the perimeter, noticing subtle signs that I wasn't imagining it. Footprints in the mud near the far edge of the clearing, broken branches, a smell faintly metallic, like iron or blood. Panic and clarity coexisted in a strange mix. I realized that I couldn't stay outside without constant vigilance. By the second night, I was barely functioning. I slept in short bursts, always alert to sounds. Every branch snapping made me flinch. Every shadow looked like a person. I stopped leaving the cabin except to gather firewood close to the door. I rationed food, drank water sparingly, and stayed alert. The presence outside was relentless, though elusive. I couldn't see it directly, but I could feel it in the atmosphere, a constant pressure that made me hyper-aware of everything. On the third day, I noticed something else, signs of deliberate surveillance. Stones arranged oddly near the edge of the clearing, small scratches on the wooden siding that weren't there before, marks in the dirt showing recent passage. Whoever or whatever had been around was no longer just passing. They were learning. I realized that staying still wasn't enough. I had to move, had to escape. I packed essentials: food, water, my knife, a flashlight, the fire starter kit. I decided to walk back to the main road, a few miles away, hoping to reach civilization before nightfall. The forest seemed different now, menacing, each tree and shadow an obstacle. The mud made my shoes heavy, and the underbrush clawed at my clothes and skin. I forced myself forward, every step calculated. Every so often, I would hear a snap behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone marking my path. But when I looked back, nothing. Hours passed. Sweat and exhaustion weighed on me, my stomach grumbling from hunger, my hands blistered from holding the backpack and knife. The forest seemed endless, oppressive. But then, finally, I glimpsed the road, a thin line of gray between the green walls of trees. Relief washed over me, adrenaline mixing with fear. I ran, stumbling, slipping in the mud, until I reached the asphalt. I flagged down the first car I saw, a truck with an older man inside. I shouted, waving my arms, and he stopped. I barely managed to explain, breathless, pointing back toward the forest. He looked at me with concern, a mixture of confusion and alarm, but he agreed to take me to the nearest police station. Later, the police came to inspect the cabin. They found signs of trespass, footprints, markings, and evidence of someone watching the place for days, maybe weeks. No one was ever caught, and they suspected that someone had been using the cabin as a hideout or a surveillance spot. The X on the tree had been a warning, a marker. The whole ordeal left me shaken, a reminder of how isolated you could be in the woods, and how vulnerable you are when no one is around. I never went back. I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. The memory of those nights, the footsteps, the shadows, the constant feeling of being watched, remained vivid, a lesson in the thin line between solitude and danger, and how quickly peace can turn into fear when isolation meets the unknown. I had planned the trip for months, mapping out every detail down to the smallest necessity. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any towns, surrounded by dense trees and a small lake that mirrored the sky in its stillness. The isolation had drawn me there, the promise of solitude, the escape from the constant noise and pressure of daily life. I wanted silence, nothing more. The first morning, driving down the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, I felt a thrill at how alone I would be. The trees arched over the road, their branches thick and tangled, blotting out the sun in parts. The air was crisp and cold, even for early summer, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp soil. I reached the cabin mid-afternoon. It sat slightly off the path, tucked into a small clearing, almost hidden by overgrown shrubs and tall grass. The structure was older than I expected, made of rough logs and weathered wood, with a tin roof that gleamed dimly in the sunlight. I had seen pictures online, but photos never truly captured how real a place felt. The porch sagged slightly, and the railing was loose in places, though it had a charm that made me feel at home immediately. I parked the car and stepped out, letting the quiet wrap around me like a thick blanket. I felt excitement mixed with something else, a small, unsettling tension that I tried to ignore. I unloaded my supplies, bags of food, blankets, water, and some basic tools. The cabin's door resisted at first, the hinges creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of wood and dust was strong, but it was not unpleasant. The air felt thick, heavy, like the walls had absorbed years of silence. The main room had a small fireplace, a kitchen area with a sink that barely worked, and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. The bedroom was tiny, with a narrow bed and a small dresser. There was no electricity, which I had expected, and I had prepared with flashlights, lanterns, and extra batteries. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and watched the flames crackle and dance in the dark. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets, no rustling animals, just the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen creature. I lay in bed listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling a sense of both calm and unease. The cabin felt safe, yet something about the isolation made my senses sharper, more alert. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of air through a crack in the wall, even the tick of the old clock that hung crookedly in the corner. The next day, I explored the surroundings. The lake was small but clear, reflecting the clouds and the surrounding trees. I walked along the shore, collecting sticks and stones, noting the tracks of animals in the soft soil. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a coyote. The forest seemed empty of humans, untouched, and beautiful in a way that felt both serene and intimidating. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to lower, the shadows stretching long and dark. The air cooled quickly, and I built the fire again, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. It was on the third night that I first sensed something was wrong. I had gone to bed later than usual, exhausted from the day's walk, and the fire had burned low. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, making the cabin moan. At first, I assumed the noises were just the building settling, the wind finding its way through cracks. But then I heard a different sound, a soft thump, then another, from the outside. Not a branch falling, not an animal moving, but deliberate, paced. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone stepping carefully but with purpose. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door slowly. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the small clearing beyond. Nothing, just the trees, their shadows stretching and twisting. I walked to the edge of the clearing, shining the light in every direction. Nothing moved. I laughed at myself, a short, nervous sound, and returned inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and it took a long time to convince myself that I had imagined it. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease by keeping busy. I collected firewood, cleaned the cabin, and prepared food. I even ventured further into the woods, following a small path I hadn't noticed before. It led to a small stream, water rushing over rocks, glinting in the sun. I knelt to drink some from my hand, feeling the cold shock of it, and noticed the tracks in the mud nearby. Not animal tracks, these were human. Shoes, maybe a boot, large size, pressed into the soft ground. My stomach twisted. I looked around, but the forest seemed empty. I tried to convince myself it was an old track, washed down by rain or left by someone weeks ago. That night, the sounds returned. This time, not thumps, but something scraping, faint and slow, around the perimeter of the cabin. I lay in bed, frozen, straining to hear, flashlight in hand. The scraping continued, stopping, starting again, moving in a pattern I couldn't understand. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I had no way to tell. The fire died in the fireplace, leaving me in near darkness. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Near the door, on the ground, were small marks in the dirt. Footprints. Human footprints, fresh, leading up to the porch and circling around. I checked the windows. Some had smudges, like someone had pressed their hands against the glass. My stomach turned over. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been here while I slept. The isolation that had felt peaceful now felt threatening. I debated leaving immediately, but the car was parked far away, and the dirt road had turned slick with recent rain. I had to wait until daylight to navigate it safely. I decided to secure the cabin as best I could. I checked every window, moved furniture to block entrances, and made makeshift alarms from empty cans and string, setting them around the perimeter. My hands shook as I worked, but I refused to sit idle. That afternoon, I stayed inside, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows, but the scraping didn't return. I moved cautiously, every step careful. Around evening, I spotted movement outside, something large moving between the trees, keeping to the shadows, always out of reach of the flashlight. I could see the outline, tall, human-shaped. I backed away, heart hammering, and ducked behind the couch. The next morning, I made a plan. I would pack quickly and leave no matter what. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. My safety was paramount. I loaded supplies into the car, keeping my eyes on the forest, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of danger. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed the tire tracks near the cabin. 2 sets of tracks now, fresh, coming from the woods, leading right up to the cabin. Someone had been watching me, following me. The reality hit me hard. I had underestimated the danger. I got into the car, locked the doors, and waited. Minutes stretched like hours as I scanned the tree line, expecting the figure to emerge. It never did. I started the engine, inching forward slowly, careful of the muddy road. As I drove, I noticed movement in the mirrors, shadows among the trees, following, always keeping just out of reach. Panic surged. I drove faster, dirt and mud splashing against the tires, branches scraping the sides of the car. It took nearly an hour to reach a paved road, my nerves shredded, eyes darting constantly. I finally saw a gas station ahead and pulled in, relief flooding me. I called the local authorities, explained as best I could, though I knew there was little they could do. They advised me to return home, avoid the area, and be vigilant. Later, I learned that the cabin was a known hideout for someone with a history of breaking into remote properties. They were never caught, though sightings were reported frequently. I had unknowingly walked into a dangerous situation, one that could have ended far worse. The isolation, the silence, the peaceful woods, all of it had been a trap in disguise. Returning home, I felt shaken but grateful. I had survived, but the memory of the cabin stayed with me. The quiet that wasn't quiet, the tracks in the dirt, the shadowed figure moving just out of sight. I couldn't forget it, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Yet, I had learned something important. Preparation and vigilance matter, but luck and intuition are just as crucial. The experience left scars, but it also left clarity. I never returned to that cabin, never even drove past the area again. But I did take steps to secure my home, to understand how vulnerable isolation can make someone. I learned to trust my instincts, to never ignore the small signals that something isn't right. And though I moved on with my life, the memory remained vivid. The sight of those human tracks in the dirt, the creak of the cabin under unseen weight, and the stark realization that danger can exist anywhere, even in the most peaceful of places. The woods can feel like a sanctuary, but sometimes they hide threats that no amount of planning can fully prepare you for. I survived, and I carried that lesson with me. Every time I look at a forest or a remote cabin, I remember the tension, the fear, and the raw reality of that experience. I also remember the relief of leaving it all behind, of reaching safety, and the clarity that comes with surviving something truly frightening. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The city had become too suffocating, too loud, and too impersonal. I craved silence, the kind that presses against your ears so sharply that even the slightest sound becomes sharp and urgent. I wanted to wake up to trees, to hear the wind moving through them, to feel that cold, damp forest air on my face. The cabin I found was small, tucked deep in the mountains, far from any road, almost unreachable unless you knew the trails. The owner insisted it was isolated, that the nearest neighbor was miles away, and that cell service was unreliable. Exactly what I wanted. I thought I would find peace, maybe some clarity, maybe even the satisfaction of testing myself against solitude. The drive there was long and winding, through roads that narrowed and dipped until it was hard to imagine a second car passing. The GPS lost signal about 15 miles before the cabin, leaving me entirely reliant on a printed map and a vague set of directions. The sky was gray, low clouds pressing against the peaks like a heavy blanket. Rain fell lightly, making the dirt roads slick and turning the edges into mud that clung stubbornly to my tires. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling my knuckles whiten with each turn. But there was a strange calm in it, too. Everything outside the windshield looked wild and untouched, as though the world beyond the mountains didn't exist. I arrived in late afternoon. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees whose trunks were dark and wet from the rain. Moss and fallen leaves covered the ground. From the outside, it looked sturdy, built from dark wood that had weathered decades of storms. A small chimney rose from the roof, and even from a distance, I could see faint smoke spiraling from it, evidence someone had used it recently. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the steps were uneven, but the structure felt solid. A small path led from the cabin to the edge of a creek that gurgled through the forest. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and unlocked the door, expecting the warm scent of wood smoke and cleaning supplies, but instead was met with the cold smell of dampness and mildew, a reminder that the cabin had been closed for some time. The interior was sparse. A small kitchen area with an old stove, a table with a few chairs, a wood-burning fireplace, and a single bedroom with a thin mattress. I set my bag down, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and explored the cabin, noting small details. The peeling paint on the door frame, the warped floorboards that creaked under my weight, the faint traces of mouse droppings in one corner. Everything seemed normal, functional, but isolated, as though the world outside the forest was a memory I had left behind. I lit the fireplace, setting the logs carefully. The flames struggled at first, wet from the humidity, but soon crackled to life, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. That was the first time I noticed how quiet it really was. The wind rustled the trees, the creek whispered in the distance, and the fire snapped occasionally, but otherwise there was nothing. No hum of electricity, no distant car engines, nothing except the natural sounds of the forest. Night came quickly, and with it the sense of being utterly alone. I had brought food, water, and a small kerosene lamp. I prepared a simple dinner, the smell of toasted bread and beans filling the cabin. As I ate, I could feel the isolation pressing against me. The shadows outside were deep and shifting. Shapes seemed to move just beyond the clearing, branches bending and swaying as though the forest itself were alive. I told myself it was just the wind. Still, a knot of unease grew in my stomach, small at first, but persistent. After dinner, I washed my few dishes and returned to the bedroom. I lay on the mattress, listening to the wind. It sounded louder now, as if it had grown more urgent. The creak, which I had barely noticed during the day, seemed louder too, closer somehow. I felt it through the floor, through the walls, a vibration in the air. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of a branch, every sudden rustle made me tense. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Around midnight, I awoke to a noise I couldn't immediately identify. It was faint at first, a scratching or scuffing sound, almost like something dragging across the wooden floorboards outside the cabin. My heart rate spiked instantly. I lay still, straining to listen. The sound stopped. Then, a low thump, like a footstep, from the far side of the cabin. My mind raced. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, a raccoon, or a stray dog. But the thump came again, heavier, closer, followed by a dragging sound that made me sit upright. My first thought was that someone had come to the cabin. But the road was miles away, and I hadn't heard a car. Whoever it was, they must have approached on foot. Panic gripped me, but I told myself to stay calm. I had a small camping knife in my bag and a lighter. That's all I had. I moved quietly to the door, trying to peer through the darkness. The moon was obscured by clouds, and all I could see was blackness, broken occasionally by the silhouette of the trees. Nothing moved. The thumping stopped, replaced by a faint scratching at the walls of the cabin. Something was circling it, testing it as though it were trying to find a weak spot. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay out of sight, listening. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. A loud snap, like someone had stepped on a branch immediately outside the cabin. Then silence again. I could barely breathe, waiting, thinking about what to do. Should I hide? Should I run? I had no car keys nearby, no way to leave without stepping into the dark forest. Hours seemed to pass this way. Every time I thought the danger had passed, there would be another noise. A thud, a scrape, a soft shuffle against the cabin siding. Eventually, exhaustion returned, dragging my adrenaline down slightly. I stayed awake, holding my knife, trying to remain as quiet as possible, listening for any signs of movement. The wind had died down, leaving only the sounds of the forest, though now they seemed sharper, more defined. Every rustle sounded like it was right next to me. I realized I hadn't heard any normal animals since the noise started. No owls, no raccoons, no small scurrying creatures. Just that deliberate testing sound of something or someone outside. When dawn finally broke, the forest changed completely. The shadows retreated, and light spilled through the trees. I forced myself to stand and look around the clearing. I saw tracks in the mud leading up to the cabin. Heavy boot prints. The size of them told me that whoever had been outside was human. My stomach turned. I examined the door. No signs of forced entry, but there were scratches along the frame, as if someone had tried to pry it open. I felt both terrified and relieved. Terrified because someone had been circling my cabin all night, and relieved because they hadn't gotten in. I spent the morning fortifying the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood against the doors and windows, checking the locks, and preparing to leave at first light if the danger returned. The next day, I decided to stay put, hoping that leaving a visible presence, smoke from the fireplace, would signal to anyone nearby that someone was inside. I moved carefully, always keeping the knife close, and checked the perimeter. The forest seemed empty, almost unnaturally quiet. I gathered water from the creek, chopped firewood, and tried to keep my mind busy. Yet every snap of a twig, every bird call, set my nerves on edge. I became hyper-aware of every movement and every sound. I noticed tiny details I hadn't before. A fresh pile of dirt near the side of the cabin, broken branches forming an almost intentional pattern, footprints that seemed to circle but never leave a clear path. It felt as though someone had been observing me for a long time, waiting for the right moment to act. By the second night, my fear had grown into a constant awareness. I slept very little, and every noise brought me to immediate alert. Around midnight, I heard the steps again, closer this time. They moved along the side of the cabin, slower now, deliberate. I could hear breathing, steady, controlled. I gripped my knife, pressed myself against the wall, and waited. Hours passed like this. Dawn eventually came again, and the person or persons had left. I inspected the cabin. More footprints, more disturbances, but no sign of damage beyond the scratches. Whoever it was had left nothing but evidence that they were here, testing, probing, waiting. I realized I could not stay. I packed my belongings, leaving no trace behind. I double-checked the door, made sure the windows were closed, and started the long walk back to the nearest road. Every step was tense. The forest, beautiful in the daylight, seemed more ominous now, full of hiding places, full of shadows. I felt eyes on me constantly, though I couldn't see anyone. The walk took hours. I kept imagining footsteps following mine, every rock and tree seeming to shift with my movement. By the time I reached the road, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and tense, but I felt safe enough to stop and catch my breath. I flagged down a passing car and accepted a ride to the nearest town. When I returned later to report what had happened, the authorities told me the area had a history of hikers and cabin visitors being targeted by people living off-grid, often staying hidden in the forests and approaching cabins quietly to steal, sometimes assault. My cabin had likely been under surveillance for weeks. The relief I felt at leaving the forest safely was immense, but it was mixed with an awareness that it could have ended very differently. That cabin trip taught me a lot about fear, vigilance, and how isolation can strip you down to your most primal instincts. It also left me with a permanent respect for the wilderness and the unknown dangers that can hide within it. I never returned, and I never will, but the memory of those nights, of the relentless circling steps and the scratching at the walls, stays with me. I learned to trust my instincts, to be prepared, and, most importantly, to respect the silence, not as peace but as a potential warning. That clarity, that lesson, is the only treasure I brought back from that forest. I had been planning this trip for months, meticulously organizing every single detail. It wasn't just a weekend escape or a short hike. It was supposed to be a retreat from everything, from the constant hum of work, the endless city noise, and the crowded streets where I felt invisible. I wanted silence, isolation, a place where the only thing I'd have to focus on was the raw, physical experience of being completely alone in the woods. I had rented a small cabin far from any road, a place I found on a sketchy listing online that seemed almost too good to be true. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin perched on the edge of a forest, surrounded by tall pines and a slow-moving creek. There was electricity and water, but barely, and no cell service for miles. That was perfect. I wanted to be cut off from the world, even if just for a few days. The drive there was long, about 6 hours from the city, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, turning the sky a dull orange and purple streak. The road was rough and winding, half dirt, half gravel, twisting through dense pine forests that pressed in on either side of me. My car rattled over rocks and potholes, and every mile I left behind civilization, the more tense and expectant I felt. There's a strange mixture of relief and fear that comes from leaving the world behind, like you're stepping into something alive and unpredictable. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how silent it was. Not the quiet you get when you close the door at home, but a deep, complete silence that pressed against your ears and made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. The cabin was small, wooden, and weathered. The paint had peeled in places, and the wooden steps leading up to the porch creaked ominously with every movement. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. I flicked on the small electric lights and set my backpack down. The room was modest. A small kitchen, a living area with a worn couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny bedroom in the back. There was a fireplace, but the stack of firewood looked old and dry, probably from last year. I unpacked quickly, setting my food, water, and supplies neatly. I wanted everything ready because I had a plan to fully immerse myself in the woods. I intended to spend the first day simply exploring the surrounding forest, taking photos, observing wildlife, and maybe even fishing in the creek. The second day, I would venture further, mapping paths and just seeing how far I could get. And the third day, I would return to the cabin and simply sit, watch, and experience the solitude. The first evening was peaceful. I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, listening to the faint trickle of the creek and the rustling of the pine needles as the wind moved through them. Birds called intermittently, and a distant deer stomped somewhere in the underbrush. Everything felt perfect. But as the sun set completely and darkness wrapped itself around the forest, the peace shifted. The sounds of the forest changed from melodic to something else, heavier, more deliberate. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me startle. I told myself it was normal, wildlife, wind, my imagination. But the tension in my body was noticeable. My instincts were on high alert. I tried to sleep that first night, but the darkness pressed against the windows like a solid wall. Shadows danced across the wooden floor with every movement of the trees outside. I kept waking up, thinking I had heard someone walking outside, only to realize it was the wind. Still, there was a subtle sense that I wasn't alone, even though I knew logically I was. I shrugged it off as paranoia and finally fell into a fitful sleep. The next day, I ventured into the forest as planned. The sun was bright, cutting through the tall pines in streaks of light that illuminated the fallen leaves and the rough, tangled roots beneath my feet. I stayed on the paths I could see, marking my trail with chalk and string to ensure I could find my way back. Everything seemed ordinary, even mundane, until I noticed small things out of place. A freshly broken branch here, an overturned rock there. Nothing that seemed immediately dangerous, but I felt watched. Not by a person necessarily, but by something conscious noticing my presence. I kept moving, trying to rationalize the feeling. Birds flew away at my approach, squirrels chattered, a rabbit bolted across a small clearing. Still, the feeling persisted. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a small hill overlooking a section of the forest I hadn't seen from the cabin. The view was beautiful, but my unease had grown into a tight knot in my chest. Shadows seemed to linger longer, and the air felt heavier. I considered turning back, but my stubbornness, or perhaps my curiosity, pushed me to keep going. That's when I first saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were deer or elk, but the pattern was wrong. Human, large, wide, with a boot-like shape. They weren't old. The soil around them was soft and disturbed, recent. My heart rate spiked, and I froze, trying to listen for any other sign of movement. There was nothing at first, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I debated whether to follow them or retreat, but something compelled me to trace them quietly from a distance. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward a small, abandoned cabin I hadn't noticed on any map. Its roof sagged, one side had partially collapsed, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. It looked dangerous, yet I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. I approached slowly, stepping lightly over the undergrowth. Every step I took felt loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. Inside the cabin, the air was damp, musty, and heavy. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting long, jagged shadows. The floor was littered with debris, old newspapers, broken furniture, and rotting food containers. And then I saw it, signs of recent habitation. A small pile of blankets in the corner, a few empty water bottles, and a makeshift fire pit in the center with cold ashes. Someone had been here recently, maybe even the same person whose footprints I had been following. Panic set in. I was alone, deep in the woods, and there was someone else nearby. I backed out slowly, careful not to make noise, and decided it was time to head back to my cabin. On the way, the unease turned into outright fear. Every crack of a branch behind me, every shadow shifting among the trees, felt like someone was following. I kept glancing over my shoulder, seeing glimpses of movement, sometimes nothing, sometimes just enough to make my pulse spike. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was dipping again, and the woods seemed darker than ever. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to convince myself I had imagined the other person. But then I noticed something chilling. A single boot print pressed into the soft dirt just outside the porch. Someone had been here while I was away. The night that followed was unbearable. Couldn't sleep. Every sound, the wind, the creak, the faint scratching at the door, made me tense. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, every shadow feeling like it could be hiding a person waiting for the right moment. I spent hours pacing, checking every lock, and staring out into the darkness, waiting for anything to happen. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk being trapped here with someone who had already been close enough to approach my cabin undetected. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind, and started the hike back to the main road. I tried to stay calm, keeping my eyes on the path ahead, listening for any sounds behind me. The forest felt different now, almost alive with awareness. I didn't dare stop until I reached my car. When I finally got into the vehicle, relief washed over me in waves. I locked the doors and started the engine, keeping the windows up. The drive back was tense, but I didn't look back. I reached civilization as the sun set completely, lights of houses and cars reassuringly normal. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, filled up and called a friend, telling them to come get me as soon as possible. After that trip, I never went back to the cabin. I researched the area and discovered that several reports had been filed about squatters and people hiding in abandoned cabins, some violent. My escape had been lucky. The fear, the constant tension, and the close calls stayed with me for weeks. I realized that the woods, beautiful and peaceful as they seemed, could conceal real danger, human danger, in ways far more terrifying than any ghost story. Months later, I finally felt safe again, but the memory of that isolation, the broken cabin, and the unknown person following my trail never left me. It changed how I approached the idea of solitude and adventure. I learned that sometimes, being alone is not about peace. It's about awareness, preparation, and respect for the unknown dangers of the real world. And I knew, deep down, that if I ever returned to a place like that, I would never again underestimate what a single human presence, silent and unseen, could do. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a year of non-stop work, the constant noise of the city, and the strain of life piling up in ways I couldn't quite shake, I decided I needed something completely different. Something quiet, isolated, and entirely detached from civilization. I found a small cabin listed online, deep in a forest in the northern mountains. It was rustic, not fancy, but that was exactly what I wanted. The description promised a true escape. No internet, no phone signal, and a location so remote that it could only be reached by a winding dirt road that most cars struggled to navigate. The idea of being completely alone, surrounded by trees and silence, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The drive up was longer and rougher than I expected. My small rental car struggled over patches of loose gravel and muddy inclines. There were moments when I thought about turning back, but something inside me refused to quit. The forest seemed to grow thicker the higher I went, the tall pines and oaks forming a dense wall on either side of the road. Shadows stretched across the path, even in daylight, giving everything an unnerving, almost oppressive feeling. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, my hands were sore from gripping the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding from the constant tension of navigating such rough terrain. The cabin itself was small but solid. A simple, rectangular wooden structure with a pitched roof and a porch that ran the length of the front. The wood was dark and weathered, but it had a sturdy look, like it had survived countless storms. The windows were small, with thick frames, and the door had a large metal latch that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. There was no sign of anyone else nearby, no footprints, no tire tracks except mine, nothing but the occasional flutter of birds in the trees. The isolation felt immediate and absolute. I parked the car and sat for a moment, taking it all in. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air, mixing with a faint scent of smoke from a chimney, though I couldn't see any smoke rising. The forest around the cabin seemed alive with subtle noises. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches swaying in the wind, the distant call of birds or perhaps something else I couldn't identify. It was peaceful in a way, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Something about being this far removed from anything familiar always carries a risk, even when the danger is not visible. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the cabin, my boots crunching on the gravel and fallen leaves. The porch was uneven, one of the boards squeaking ominously under my weight. I lifted the latch on the door, and it opened with a low groan. Inside, The cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. Sunlight filtered in through the small windows, illuminating a modest living space with a table, a few chairs, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a single bedroom off to the side and a small bathroom, though the plumbing looked unreliable at best. I set my bag down and began exploring. The first thing I did was check the stove and the small pile of firewood stacked neatly nearby. I was relieved to find that there was enough wood to last the night, so I started a small fire. The crackle and warmth immediately made the space feel less alien and more like a place I could inhabit, at least temporarily. I moved slowly through the cabin, noting every detail. The slight gaps in the floorboards that could let cold air seep in, the dusty corners where no one had bothered to clean, the faint scratch marks on the wooden walls that might have been made by animals or something else. Everything had a story, even if I didn't know what that story was. By late afternoon, I was settled in enough to start feeling a strange mix of contentment and unease. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted, yet there was a part of me that kept listening, attuned to every sound. I reminded myself it was just the forest, creatures moving in the underbrush, the wind, the trees shifting, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I tried to distract myself by unpacking supplies and preparing a simple meal on the stove, the repetitive tasks helping to push away the creeping tension. As night fell, the cabin changed. The shadows lengthened, the woods outside darkened to an almost impenetrable black, and every sound seemed amplified. The wind moved through the trees with a low whistle, and I could hear twigs snapping in the distance. My imagination ran wild. I thought about the stories I had read of people who disappeared in forests, the tales of hikers who never returned, and the natural predators that roamed remote areas. Though I knew the risks were mostly manageable, the knowledge did little to ease my anxiety. I decided to secure the cabin as best I could. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure the latch was firm and nothing could easily be pried open. Then I sat near the fire, listening, watching, waiting. Hours passed. The forest outside remained alive with faint movements and sounds, and I realized I had been holding my breath, hyper-aware of the smallest noises. A sudden scraping sound near the porch made my heart leap. It was subtle, like something heavy being dragged or shifted, and it stopped as quickly as it started. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the gravel and the surrounding trees. My mind raced through possibilities. A raccoon, a fallen branch, some other small animal. But the noise had sounded deliberate, unnatural in a way that made my stomach churn. I stood there for what felt like forever, my ears straining for any further movement. Finally, with nothing else happening, I decided to go back inside, locking the door behind me and checking the windows again. The night was restless. Every small sound made me tense. I had taken precautions, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside again, closer this time. A series of deliberate knocks, slow and spaced out, echoed faintly against the walls of the cabin. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a branch falling or a small animal. This had a pattern, a purpose. I stayed frozen, listening. The knocking continued for a few moments and then stopped abruptly. Silence fell again, oppressive and heavy. I didn't sleep much that night, only dozing intermittently with my ears straining for the faintest noise. By morning, the forest seemed more benign in daylight, though the unease lingered. I went outside to inspect the perimeter. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed except for a few animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox, but nothing indicated that a person had been nearby. Still, the memory of the knocking and scraping kept me alert. I decided to stay inside and avoid going too far from the cabin until I felt certain I was truly alone. As the day progressed, I occupied myself with chores and small explorations around the clearing. I gathered firewood, checked the small stream nearby for water, and mapped the immediate area in my mind. Despite my precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been outside the cabin the night before, observing, waiting. I tried to reason with myself. The remote location, the lack of road traffic, and the distance from the nearest neighbor made it unlikely anyone would have been there. But that didn't stop the lingering anxiety that grew heavier with each hour. That evening, as darkness fell once more, I fortified the cabin further. I moved furniture against the door, placed a heavy log at the threshold, and made sure every window was secure. I sat with the fire burning, a flashlight at the ready, mentally preparing for a long night. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again. The soft scrape of something against the wood, followed by deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The sounds stopped abruptly at one point, leaving only the wind whispering through the trees. I waited, heart pounding, knowing I needed to remain calm and not panic. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire alive, its warmth a small comfort against the cold dread pressing in from every corner. When dawn finally arrived, I cautiously peered outside. The forest seemed unchanged, but my relief was cautious. I had survived the night, but the presence of someone or something outside was undeniable. I inspected the perimeter once more and discovered fresh footprints in the soft mud near the porch. They were human, adult-sized, but led only around the cabin's edges and into the denser trees, never approaching the door directly. My stomach turned. Someone had been there. They had circled, observed, then left. I realized then that I couldn't stay, not with the isolation so absolute and the presence outside so tangible. I packed quickly, carefully checking every item, leaving no trace of myself. I kept a small pocket knife within reach and a flashlight at the ready as I drove down the winding dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any movement. I didn't stop until I reached the main road and the faint signs of civilization, a gas station where other cars and people existed. The tension began to fade slightly, replaced by relief and a lingering awareness that the forest was a place where solitude could turn dangerous in an instant. The experience stayed with me for weeks after. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I became acutely aware of how vulnerable isolation could make a person. But it also taught me something important, that preparation, awareness, and caution can mean the difference between safety and disaster in the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't intend to, but the memory remains vivid. The forest, silent and imposing, reminded me that even in a world without supernatural threats, the unknown and unseen can be far more frightening than any ghost. In the end, I learned to respect both the wilderness and my own limits. I understood that fear in isolation is not always irrational. It can be a signal to pay attention, to move carefully, and to survive. I left the mountains with a renewed sense of caution and a deeper understanding of the fragile balance between solitude and danger. That cabin, that forest, and the quiet footsteps that circled it are forever etched in my memory. A reminder that the world can be as terrifying as it is beautiful, and that vigilance can be the difference between safety and calamity. I didn't realize how far off the map I had gone until the phone signal completely disappeared. I had been driving for hours on winding forest roads, the kind that twist and curve so sharply that I had to grip the steering wheel tightly to keep from sliding into the trees. The GPS had insisted there was a shortcut, and I had believed it, thinking it would save me some time. Instead, it led me to a narrow dirt path that was barely wide enough for a single car. The trees pressed in on both sides, dense and unmoving, like silent sentinels. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and shadows stretched between the trunks in long, sharp lines. The cabin itself looked abandoned, or at least rarely used. It was a small, squat structure, made of darkened wood that had weathered decades of wind, rain, and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and a thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, which suggested someone had been here recently, or maybe it was just a trick of the fading light. The windows were grimy, so I couldn't see inside clearly. The front door was slightly ajar, squeaking faintly when the wind pushed it. I had been planning a weekend alone to escape the city, to read, write, and just be surrounded by nature. But the longer I stood there, the more the cabin seemed to assert itself as something more than a simple retreat. The stillness pressed against me, heavy and deliberate. I forced myself to shake it off and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, old smoke, and something faintly metallic, like iron. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I ran my hand along the wall to keep my balance and noted the furniture. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was arranged neatly. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted sink and a countertop littered with what might have been old food containers. I didn't dare touch them. I set my backpack down and took stock of my surroundings. The cabin had a single bedroom and a small loft above, accessible by a steep ladder. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, which I inspected carefully. The firebox was empty, but there was a stack of wood nearby. I decided that would have to do for warmth if the temperature dropped too far tonight. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed signs that someone had been here recently. A partially used bottle of water, a cigarette but in an ashtray, and footprints in the dust leading from the door to the kitchen. The idea that I wasn't truly alone in this remote area made the hair on my arms rise. I brushed it off. People hike, people stay in cabins. I wasn't the first stranger to walk through here. Still, I kept my eyes alert, scanning the windows, the doors, and even the ceiling. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest around the cabin became impenetrably dark. The wind moved through the trees with a strange rhythm, rattling branches against each other. I lit a lantern I found in the cabin and placed it on the kitchen counter. Its glow revealed more details. Scratches on the wooden floor, some deep, some shallow, a small patch of the wall where the wood seemed chewed or gouged, and faint stains that I didn't want to identify. My stomach knotted. I realized I was not just alone in an empty cabin. I was alone in a cabin that might have been used by someone or something living rough in the forest. I decided to make myself comfortable anyway. I stacked the firewood, cleaned the stove as best I could, and tried to settle in. The sound of my own movements echoed off the walls, unnaturally loud in the silence. At some point, I began hearing noises outside. At first, I convinced myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, or maybe a bear rummaging in the distance. But then I started hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the dirt just outside the cabin. I froze. My ears strained to distinguish between animal and human. I had my backpack with me where I kept a small knife. Not much, but enough to feel slightly less helpless. I approached the window carefully and peered through the grime. Nothing, just the black outlines of trees and the dim shadow of the roof overhang. I watched for what felt like hours, listening, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then I heard it again, a faint scrape along the outer wall. My pulse jumped, my hands sweaty. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. I could hear them breathing, almost human in rhythm. I tried the door quietly. It was locked, not from the outside, but from a simple latch I could engage with my hand. I did, moving slowly, listening as the noises outside shifted. Footsteps moving from one side of the cabin to the other. A shadow past a window. I could just make out a figure crouched low, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think. I had to remain calm. I moved the ladder to the loft and climbed as quietly as I could. From there, I could see most of the cabin. I grabbed the knife and a heavy flashlight, trying to make a plan. Whoever it was, I didn't know if they were armed. I didn't want to provoke them, but I couldn't just sit and wait. I remembered the back door. It was partially hidden by a fallen tree branch and overgrown vines. If I could get there quietly, I might be able to escape into the woods, use the terrain to lose anyone following me. But I had no idea what kind of forest lay behind the cabin, how thick it was, how far I'd have to go, or if it even led to another road. Still, staying was not safe. I waited until the footsteps moved toward the front again, then slipped down the ladder and across the cabin. My heart pounded as I reached the back door, fumbling with the latch. Clicked open. I peeked outside. Nothing, just the blackness of the forest, the wind whispering through the trees. I stepped out slowly, keeping low, and slipped into the woods. The underbrush tore at my clothes and scratched my arms, but I kept moving. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept telling myself to keep calm, to move quietly, to avoid leaving a trail that anyone could follow. The forest seemed endless, the darkness absolute. I relied on my flashlight intermittently, careful not to shine it too often and reveal my position. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. I had no sense of time. My legs ached, my lungs burned from exertion, and I felt sweat chill on my back in the night air. Eventually, I stumbled upon a creek. The sound of running water reassured me, made me feel slightly less isolated. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or some sign of civilization. At some point, I realized I wasn't being followed. No footsteps, no shadowy presence, just the wind and water and the occasional distant cry of a nocturnal animal. I allowed myself to breathe a little easier, though I kept moving, not daring to stop until I saw lights in the distance. Eventually, I reached a small ranger station at the edge of the forest. I was filthy, bleeding from minor cuts, and shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, but I was safe. The rangers took me in, offered blankets, and called the local police. I explained everything I could, though I had no clear evidence beyond my story and the footprints in the cabin. A search of the area revealed an abandoned campsite nearby, evidence of someone squatting for months, and the cabin itself showed signs of recent habitation by someone living rough, possibly dangerous, but no one was found at the time. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, medical checkups, and paperwork. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about the person or people who had been there watching, waiting. The forest had swallowed them back into its depths, and I had no idea if I'd ever know what truly happened. I never returned to that part of the forest. I kept my cabin trips closer to public lands, where other people were around, but the memory stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the darkness pressing against every sense, the realization that being alone in the wilderness can be more dangerous than anything in the city. In the end, I survived because I stayed calm, thought logically, and used every advantage the cabin and the forest offered me. I understood that fear is real, but it can be managed. The cabin remained a stark reminder that danger is not always supernatural. Sometimes it is simply human or animal instincts, hidden in places where no one else will see. The story of that night, the fear, and the relief of reaching safety became something I carried with me, shaping the way I approached solitude and wilderness forever. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, the noise, the endless obligations, had consumed me for weeks, and I wanted a place where I could be completely alone. Somewhere far from people, far from the constant hum of traffic and the flicker of screens. That's how I found the cabin. It was small, unassuming, and tucked deep in a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. The pictures online had shown a modest wooden structure, surrounded by tall pines and a small clearing. There was no electricity, no running water, nothing but the cabin and the trees around it. It promised the kind of isolation I craved. I packed my car with supplies, checking and rechecking everything. Food that could last a week without refrigeration, a gas stove with extra fuel, plenty of bottled water, warm clothing, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and, of course, a good backpacking knife. The drive was long, winding through narrow, wooded roads that became narrower and more uneven as I went farther into the forest. I felt the kind of tension that comes from being completely alone, but it was mixed with excitement. There was something freeing about being disconnected from the world. When I finally reached the small dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Simple, wooden, with a porch that creaked when I stepped on it. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and carried in my supplies. The cabin was basic but sufficient. A small kitchen area, a wood stove, a few shelves with empty jars and cans, a table and 2 small bedrooms. The windows were dirty, streaked with rain and dust, and I could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere nearby. I unpacked slowly, methodically. I put the food in a box in one corner, stacked the blankets neatly, and set up my sleeping area. As I worked, I felt a growing awareness of the silence around me. There were no birds, no insects buzzing, just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive, as if the forest itself were watching. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on organizing, on preparing for a week away from civilization. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the wood stove, cooked a simple meal, and settled in to sleep. The floorboards creaked as I moved, the wind rattled the windows, and the shadows from the fire danced across the walls. I felt a strange tension, a low hum of anxiety, but I told myself it was just being alone. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and uneven terrain. I found the stream I had heard, a narrow ribbon of clear water running through the trees. The air was cool and damp, filled with the smell of wet earth and pine. I walked for hours, noting landmarks in my mind so I could find my way back. The forest was beautiful, but there was something oppressive about it too. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped calling, insects seemed to vanish, and every sound I made echoed unnaturally through the trees. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to fall. That night, I made another fire, ate a modest meal, and tried to relax. But as darkness fell, I began to notice things. Small sounds at first, a branch snapping far off, the rustle of leaves, but then closer, heavier. Something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox. Anything but what my mind began to imagine. I stayed awake longer than usual, listening, waiting. By midnight, I was on edge, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion. The next morning, I discovered something that unsettled me even more. The cabin door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. Nothing inside had been disturbed, but the fact that the door had moved at all made my stomach turn. I double-checked the locks, inspected the windows, and even looked for footprints around the porch. There were none, at least none that were obvious. I tried to tell myself I must have been careless, that the wind had shifted it, but a nagging doubt persisted. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day, preparing for the possibility that someone or something might be nearby. I gathered firewood, inspected the perimeter, and made sure I had my knife easily accessible. Every sound made me jump. A branch breaking in the distance, the flutter of wings, the murmur of the stream. By evening, I was exhausted, tense, and more aware than ever of my own vulnerability. The cabin, which had felt safe and secluded before, now felt fragile and exposed. That night, the sounds returned, closer this time. Footsteps in the underbrush, slow and deliberate. I kept the fire burning brightly, moving the chair so I could sit near the door and watch. Hours passed with nothing appearing, but the noises continued, soft, cautious, but undeniably human. I realized that someone might be nearby, someone hiding in the woods, observing. My mind raced with possibilities. I thought about my options. I could leave, but the car was parked out of sight down the narrow path. I could call for help, but there was no signal. I could try to defend myself, but I had no weapons beyond the knife and my own strength. I decided to wait until dawn. Night in the forest had its own rules, and I was not willing to take chances in the dark. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten, my body cramped and aching from sitting still. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I saw it. Footprints, leading from the edge of the clearing to the cabin and back again. Not animal tracks, human. They were large, heavy, and careful. Someone had been there all night, circling, watching, waiting. My stomach turned. I knew I had to leave. I packed my supplies quickly but quietly, making sure to leave nothing behind that could slow me down. I slipped out the back door, staying low in the shadows, and moved toward the car. The path seemed longer than I remembered, the forest somehow more oppressive in the light of day. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I reached the car, keys in hand, and hesitated only a moment before climbing inside and locking the doors. The drive out of the forest was tense. I kept my eyes on the road, watching for any movement at the edges of the trees. I imagined someone following me, staying just out of sight. The further I went, the more the tension eased, but it didn't fully leave me until I reached a small town, where the road widened, People were visible, and the world felt familiar again. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but there was little they could do. There had been reports of break-ins and trespassers in the area, but no one had ever confronted them directly. They advised me to avoid staying alone in isolated cabins in the future. I took their advice seriously. The memory of that cabin haunted me for weeks. I replayed the nights in my mind, analyzing every sound, every movement, every detail. It changed the way I thought about isolation, about being alone in a place where no one could help you. I realized that the forest was not inherently dangerous, but it could hide danger in plain sight. People could move silently, observing, waiting, and you would never know until it was too late. Over time, I began to reclaim my sense of safety, but I never returned to the forest in that way. I learned to respect the wilderness, to respect the unknown, and to always assume that even the quietest places could be hiding someone else entirely. The experience left me more cautious, more aware, but it also gave me a sense of resilience. I had faced real fear and I had survived. I had learned that preparation, vigilance, and a clear mind were essential in situations like that. Eventually, I found other ways to escape, other cabins closer to civilization with emergency services within reach. I still sought solitude, still craved quiet, but I did so with respect and caution. And when I think back to that first cabin, I remember the oppressive silence, the footsteps in the night, and the sharp, icy fear that settled in my chest. But I also remember the relief of reaching safety, the clarity that came from surviving, and the knowledge that I had faced something real, something that tested my instincts and my judgment, and come through it intact. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The plan was simple: drive deep into the mountains, leave the world behind, and spend a week alone in a small cabin I had rented through a local website. The cabin was isolated, almost hidden, and that was exactly what I wanted. I needed silence, a break from the constant noise of emails, phone calls, and city life. I had packed carefully, checked and double-checked my gear, and made sure I had enough food, water, and supplies to last longer than I planned to stay. I even brought extra blankets and a backup heater, just in case the temperature dropped at night. The mountains in this region could get cold fast, even in late summer, and I had no intention of getting caught unprepared. The drive was long, winding through roads that seemed narrower with each mile. The trees grew thicker and taller, the sun disappearing behind the dense canopy as I drove. I had a paper map, even though I had GPS, because I didn't trust the signal to hold up in such a remote area. As I followed the directions to the cabin, I noticed how few cars passed by, and every so often, I would see old signs of logging or abandoned cabins in the distance. It gave me a strange feeling, a mix of awe and unease. I had always loved nature, but I was aware that I was leaving almost all signs of civilization behind. Finally, after a 3-hour drive, I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. It was old but solid, with wood that had weathered over the years but seemed well maintained. There was a small porch, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it, and smoke curling faintly from the chimney. I parked the car on a dirt path that led to the cabin and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic like iron from rain-soaked soil. I shrugged it off. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a table, and a few chairs. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner of the living area. The bedroom was tiny, with a single bed, a blanket, and a small dresser. There was a bathroom, very basic, with a shower and a sink. The cabin felt quiet, almost too quiet, but I liked that. I unpacked my things, set up the bed, checked the stove, and lit a fire in it to take the chill off the room. The warmth spread slowly, and I felt a sense of relief. This was what I had come for. Isolation, peace, and the chance to be completely alone with my thoughts. The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate it slowly, and then spent hours sitting by the fire, reading a book I had brought. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and occasionally, I could hear the distant sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. I wasn't afraid. I was aware. I had been camping before and knew the forest had its own life that could be intimidating if ignored, but I felt ready. I went to bed early, leaving the fire to die down safely, and slept deeply in the quiet cabin. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I walked for hours through the forest, keeping a mental note of landmarks so I could return easily. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth that made progress slow, but the smell of wet earth and pine was intoxicating. I found a small creek, clear and cold, where I stopped to drink and refill my water bottles. I saw tracks, deer, raccoon, maybe a bear, but none of them close enough to worry about. It felt like a perfect adventure, a break from routine, a chance to be self-reliant. That evening, I returned to the cabin, tired but satisfied. I built a larger fire this time, intending to keep it burning through the night. I cooked another meal, carefully cleaning everything afterward to avoid attracting animals. I went to bed feeling safe, but as I drifted off to sleep, I became aware of a sound outside the cabin. First, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a soft, deliberate sound, like someone stepping carefully through the dirt and leaves. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, paused, then moved away. My heart began to beat faster. I had thought I would be completely alone, but now I wasn't so sure. I got up quietly and looked out the window. The darkness pressed against the glass, broken only by the faint glow of the dying fire. I saw nothing, no figure, no movement, just shadows shifting in the trees. I went back to bed, trying to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving near the edge of the clearing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind made me tense. I kept imagining someone outside, watching, waiting. I stayed awake for hours, listening, until exhaustion finally took me. The following day, I decided to make myself a bit more secure. I gathered more firewood, checked the doors and windows, and made sure everything was locked and latched. I also walked the perimeter of the cabin to see if there were any signs of other humans approaching. That's when I noticed them. Footprints in the soft soil around the cabin. They were human, not animal, and they didn't match mine. They were fresh, and they led to the edge of the forest and then disappeared. My stomach sank. I was alone in a remote area, with no neighbors for miles, and someone had been close enough to leave tracks around my cabin. I spent the rest of the day in a mix of tension and preparation. I moved my car closer to the cabin door, gathered extra sticks and logs for the fire, and placed a hatchet near the door, just in case. I stayed alert, listening for anything unusual. That night, the sounds returned. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving around the cabin. I kept the fire burning brightly and stayed awake, watching the windows. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I realized that whoever had come here had not tried to enter the cabin. Maybe they were scouting, maybe they were lost. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. The next morning, I resolved to leave if I didn't see anyone. I packed supplies and prepared to head back to civilization. But as I walked outside, I found something new. A piece of paper, partially covered by dirt, placed carefully near the door. I picked it up. It was blank except for a single word, written in a hurried, messy hand. Leave. My pulse quickened. I had confirmation that it wasn't an accident, that someone had been here intentionally. I checked the area again. No footprints leading away, no signs of where they might have gone. I felt trapped, vulnerable, and very aware of how isolated I was. I made a decision. I would leave immediately, but I couldn't drive off without a plan. The roads were narrow, and if someone was still around, they could easily block me or watch me from the forest. I packed quickly, took my map, and decided to walk a short distance to a wider part of the road where I could safely start the car. I kept my hatchet in my hand, my eyes scanning constantly. The forest felt alive, oppressive, and heavy. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking I could see movement just beyond the trees, a shadow that disappeared when I looked directly at it. It took longer than expected to reach the road, but I made it without incident. I got into the car and started it quietly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I drove slowly at first, then gradually faster as I felt a sense of relief. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The roads twisted and climbed, the trees thick, the mountains steep. I drove for hours without seeing another vehicle or person. Every mile away from the cabin felt like a victory. Eventually, I reached a small town. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I parked at a gas station, locked the doors, and sat for a long time, letting the adrenaline drain. I bought water, filled the tank, and called a friend to let them know I was okay. The feeling of safety, of returning to civilization, was almost intoxicating. I realized how fragile the sense of security was when you are isolated, and how easily it could be threatened by someone else's presence. After that experience, I never doubted the need to be cautious in remote areas. I realized that people's intentions could not always be known, and that isolation, while beautiful, also came with real risks. The memory of those footsteps, of the paper, of the quiet menace around the cabin, stayed with me for a long time. But I also carried the sense of resilience it gave me, the ability to stay calm, to observe, to act decisively in a dangerous situation. I returned home safely, and the cabin remained in the back of my mind. I never went back, and I never spoke to anyone about the location. It was a private lesson, learned the hard way, about the limits of trust, the importance of preparation, and the reality of danger in places that feel untouched and quiet. And even though I carried the memory of fear, I also carried a sense of accomplishment. I had faced it, survived it, and walked away stronger and more aware. From then on, every time I planned a solo trip, I checked everything twice, left multiple plans with friends, and never underestimated the power of being alone in a wilderness that could be as dangerous as it was beautiful. The experience changed me, sharpened my instincts, and gave me a clarity about caution and awareness that I had never had before. I learned to respect the forest, not as a magical place, but as a real place where isolation could be both thrilling and terrifying. And I learned that the safest person to trust in such a situation is yourself, and your own preparedness.